The ability for HxA to provide grants for HX community events and other activities are made possible in full through the support of the John Templeton Foundation. The opinions expressed at these events or through such activities are those of the individual grantees, organizers, speakers, presenters, other sponsors, and attendees of such events and activities, and do not necessarily reflect the views of Heterodox Academy and or the John Templeton Foundation. We encourage you to join the Heterodox Academy K-12 education community, the Educational Liberty Alliance, and to check out the Mill Center for the Advancement of Critical Thinking. Information on these organizations can be found on the conference website resources page, where you will also find useful links to K-12 curricula and other materials. Please visit that website at www.k12diversethought.org. The panelists will answer questions during our final session, but throughout our event, when you have a question, please type it in the chat, along with the name of the panelist you are directing it to, if it's being directed to someone in particular. We will try to get to as many questions as possible in our final session. And last, thank you for your patience as we transition between sessions and spotlights. It may be bumpy, but we will get there. Thank you, and I'm excited to get started.
Hey, hello everyone. My name is Samantha Hedges, and I will be moderating our first session. I am Heterodox Academy's K-12 program manager and a longtime supporter of Heterodox Academy and diversity of thought in general. I've spent my entire adult career working in education, from teaching, nonprofits, and I recently finished my PhD in education policy from Indiana University. So to get started, I'm going to have each panelist introduce themselves, and then I'm going to have them start with the question, why did you decide to become an educator? I'll have Eric, why don't you go first?
Hi, excuse me. I'm Eric Smith, Associate Professor of Rhetoric and Composition at York College of Pennsylvania. I am also a Senior Fellow for the Foundation Against Intolerance and Racism, and I am a co-founder of Free Black Thought. And the question, I believe, is why did I get into education?
Yes, sir.
Well, there can be a 3-hour conference about just that, but I'll try to sum it up as well as I can. I tell this story a lot, actually, about growing up in a predominantly white area and then going to a diverse high school and realizing that I wasn't considered authentic in my Blackness or something like that. What that did for me is help me realize the importance of different values, attitudes, and beliefs, or what social linguist James G. calls capital D discourse, right? Discourse as in not just communicating, but also considering the values, attitudes, beliefs, social identities that inform how we communicate. Once I realized that I wasn't the right kind of Black, for lack of a better term, I was very fascinated by, where people were coming from ideologically, where I was coming from ideologically, and why they were bumping together, right, and not coalescing. I didn't have any of this language at the time, mind you. I would realize later on that becoming an academic would afford me the opportunity and ethos to talk about these things and to try to instill in my students and colleagues viewpoint diversity, recognizing that there is no one way to be Black or white or Asian or what have you. That's what I'm trying to put forth. So that is why I am here.
Thank you, Eric. Jessica, you can go next.
Sure. So my name is Jessica Minick, and I'm a high school ELA teacher in Suffern Central School District, which is in Rockland County, New York. So I found my way to Heterodox Academy because of a global perspectives and research course that I've been teaching for a number of years. And the course focuses on critical thinking skills and exploring diverse and, most importantly, contrasting views on contemporary issues. And so my work in preparing for that course allowed me the opportunity to work closely with other organizations that had similar goals, like Open Mind and a company called Alelo, which is actually started by a former Global Perspectives and Research course student of mine. So why did I become an educator? More specifically, why I became an ELA teacher. I think it really stems from my lifelong love of reading. I'm a total book geek. So I opted for a profession where I get to read constantly, voraciously, and even more importantly, I get the opportunity to reread if I'm teaching the same course and using the same works. And then on top of that, I get the added benefit of having conversations with young adults in hopes of inspiring them to either discover or rediscover what can be gained from reading, and especially that parlays into viewpoint diversity. You read across authors, across disciplines, across the genres, and I think there's a lot to be gained from that. The other thing I appreciate about being an educator is I get to also be a student, and I have continuous opportunities to learn, not only from books, but all different types of people with different viewpoints, whether that be my students, my colleagues, or fellow panelists that I'm sitting here with today.
Great, thank you. And last but not least, John.
Hi, I'm John Zimmerman. I'm a historian at the University of Pennsylvania. And what I do is I study the ways that people have interacted with schools and universities, and mostly what they want schools and universities to do across space and time. I'm also an op-ed columnist, and I write a column a week about different subjects related to education and politics. I don't think I have as great a story as Erec about how I got into education, except that I've always been interested in the way that human beings develop and the choices that they make about their lives and what influences those choices. When I became a parent, my two daughters would get very annoyed because whenever I met somebody in public with them, I would say, "Where are you from?" They'd be like, "Dad, why do you always ask people where they're from?" And the reason is I'm interested in the communities that make us who we are. And if you tell me where you're from, I start to understand that. And so after I graduated college, I knew that I wanted to be involved in this process of education. I joined the Peace Corps and I was sent to rural Nepal, part of the country that was 3 days from vehicular traffic. In a part of Nepal where most people had never seen a white person or a non-Nepali. And I think it was really there that my decision solidified, because not only did I realize that I'd love to be a teacher, but I was also exposed just to the incredible diversity of humanity and the different assumptions that people brought to everything, including to education. And so that's what I've spent my life both doing and studying.
Great, thank you. Yeah, so our focus of this first session is cultivating a school community of viewpoint diversity. And so my next question for each of you is, why are you committed to viewpoint diversity? We'll go the other way. Why don't we start with John?
Oh, this is a great disappointment. Because D, I always go last, and I'm accustomed to it. You know, the first shall be last. I'm committed to it because, first of all, it makes life interesting. I know that must sound incredibly pedestrian to many of you, but I think sometimes cliches are true. That's how they become cliches. You know, I work at my primary appointment is at a school of education where almost everybody who teaches and studies there seems to share the same broader viewpoint, and it's not very interesting. I think life is way more interesting and challenging and fruitful when we're around diversity of opinion. The other thing is, and this is my academic side, I think it's the best way to improve ourselves as human beings, and especially to find out what's true and what isn't. Being around people that agree with you turns out to be a very bad way to discover truth. In fact, it works the opposite, right? It creates groupthink. There's a reason we call it that. And for me as an academic, as a scholar, and also as a professor, I've found the best way to create knowledge, the best way to find truth and new knowledge is by exposing yourself to lots of things that aren't you. Alas, one of the things the pollsters have taught us is that the more formal education you have in this country, the less likely you are to report having conversations with people of a different political ideology than yourself. In other words, education does precisely the opposite of the story that we tell about it. Especially in the liberal arts, what we say is that education should expose you to things that are not you. And I believe that as an ideal. But I believe that right now in America, politically, unfortunately, it has precisely the opposite effect. And instead of exposing you to things that aren't you, it creates a bubble that reinforces whatever views you've come in with.
Great, thank you. It's a great point. How about Jessica?
Sure.
I promise I won't have you be the middle the next time.
It's okay. So similar to what Jonathan was just saying in terms of students being exposed to viewpoints that aren't them, I can say as a high school teacher, I see the importance of doing that in a secondary ed environment before they get off to college, knowing that they will be exposed to far greater, well, in theory, far greater diversity of viewpoint. So as a secondary ed teacher, I really see the importance of bringing viewpoint diversity in the K through 12 education environment. And I think it helps me to help them become better problem solvers and feel more empowered to try to solve problems, because the problems that they want to address or are hoping to address are incredibly complex, and they really kind of require them to seek out and understand all perspectives. And like Jonathan was saying, especially the perspectives that they don't hold themselves. It's incredibly challenging. I can speak from personal experience for high school students to kind of wrap their heads around it. But I don't think they will be in a position to kind of innovate and develop enduring solutions if they don't go through that process of exposing themselves to viewpoint diversity. And similar to Jonathan, like I kind of firmly believe, or have come to believe, in what Mill says in terms of, you know, rhetoric and argument. If you only know your side of the argument, you know little of that. So from a rhetorical standpoint, there is value to testing your own personal arguments and kind of working through the contrast or the conflict that comes up and kind of testing those against others. And that helps you strengthen your own point of view. And then just on a more personal or human level, I just find that it helps them with life outside of school. We hopefully will come to interact with people who hold different views than ourselves. But I think it's important to learn how to engage with those who have different views and the value that comes from that. So teaching students how to communicate and collaborate across difference, I think really helps them in their personal relationships, whether it be friends, family members, or the professional relationships that they're going to go on to have. So I see that it helps them in more than just an academic sense.
Oh, great point. Thank you. And Eric?
It's interesting when I quote the same line from John Stuart Mill, I'm accused of utilizing white ways of knowing. So, you know, it goes nowhere when I use it. But the reason why I'm into viewpoint diversity is because well, two reasons. The first is I'm not a big fan of essentialism, you know, be it racial essentialism, political essentialism, ratio political essentialism. I'm not a big fan of it, which is why my co-founders and I created Free Black Thought. It's a site that, you know, kind of showcases the diversity of viewpoint within, you know, the Black artist community, Black academics, Black activists, right? There is more than one way to be and think Black, I guess. And we would like to see that compendium on the website, a list of all these diverse thinkers within the Black quote unquote community. We'd like to see that utilized by educators. whether it be the college level where I am at or K through 12, having one topic presented and exposing students to various viewpoints on that topic and having them come to their own conclusions. They seem to be getting fed one ideology about authentic Blackness. And I think that's a mistake. So that's my first reason. The second reason is, well, I'm a rhetorician. Rhetoricians are all about effective communication. And if we can't, tolerate or at least consider other viewpoints, then, we're not very good rhetoricians, right? We need to understand other people in order to speak to them effectively. And I see too much of that not happening in the college level. And I hear from friends who are teaching at the high school level or middle school level. I heard from yesterday 2 school boards asking me to speak to them about critical race theory and how it's manifesting in schools and how it's supposed to manifest in schools, if at all. So this seems to be a thing. And I think this circles around rhetoric, the ability to use language effectively and persuasively. So those are the 2 reasons why I'm into this.
Great, thank you so much. Yeah, so all 3 of you, expressed, obviously, you support viewpoint diversity, which is why you're joining us today, and can see kind of the problems with, for example, being in a homogenous community might be a barrier to viewpoint diversity, but also the good of it. So helping to solve problems, things of that nature. So in your experience as an educator, I'd like each of you to touch on what are the most and least successful ways of promoting viewpoint diversity in the classroom. So just imagine you're advising a teacher on this. So we'll start with the high school teacher, Jessica.
I can tell you that what I learned to be most successful came through a lot of missteps and failures, a lot of discussions about charged issues that went disastrously wrong. And after trying and not kind of getting to where I wanted us all to be, the major epiphany I had was that students, at least high school students, they really need to be taught how to have these conversations before you even have the conversations. And that's really what prompted me to reach out to Heterodox Academy to begin with, because I needed help. I wasn't doing it effectively and I needed to do it better. And so it was a matter of finding tools and resources such as Open Mind that kind of help set the foundation for how we're going to interact and engage with each other. Kind of talking about how we're all wired psychologically and the kind of barriers that presents and how we can kind of work through those collectively. And then it also came down to establishing classroom culture. So it became more incumbent on me as an educator to really take the time up front to foster that, to kind of build a sense of trust amongst all of us in the classroom, to kind of know that we're all coming from places of good intent. And that, this was a learning journey that we were all going to take, and we were all going to make mistakes, and that was okay. And we would continue to kind of reflect upon them and kind of figure out what was working and what we could improve upon. So I do a lot of work up front to help us or help better prepare my students before we even get into, okay, like here's the topic we're going to talk about. And here are the different viewpoints that we're going to kind of analyze and discuss and kind of navigate our way through.
Okay, great, thank you. We'll go to Erec. Least and most successful in your classroom.
Least successful, well, I mean, that's difficult. I know for certain that only presenting one viewpoint of something, a topic, whether it's theoretical, historical, or whatever, that's not conducive to viewpoint diversity at all. Expecting students to provide the viewpoint diversity and their opinions of these topics is good, but it tends to prompt better discussion when they have 2 opposing views, right? And they see that there is one way to, there's more than one way to look at this, and they can perhaps provide a third or fourth way of looking at it. I guess not having that viewpoint diversity is the weak point. What tends to work in my classes, and this aligns with my wish for the compendium and free Black thought to be used by college educators and K-12 educators. I'm pushing that, by the way, and shamelessly so. So go to the website and take a look at that. Anyway, there are activities like the ideological Turing test, which means that a student is charged with summarizing his or her viewpoint and then strong manning or steel manning the opposing viewpoint, right? Writing this out, so a paragraph about what I believe, a paragraph fairly representing what the other person believes, and looking at where they may overlap and determining, once and for all what you really think. There's a genre of writing called the Rogerian essay, put forth by Carl Rogers, and that builds in ideological Turing testing, right? The format of the essay is I give my opinion, I give a fair assessment of the opposite opinion, I see where we could both be right or wrong, and I come to a conclusion ultimately. Those seem to be powerful ways of, promoting viewpoint diversity. Last but not least, something kind of similar to what Jessica was saying regarding having the students prepare to have effective conversation before they actually have the effective conversation. I believe we skip that often. And social and emotional learning in its original understanding addressed that. It overlaps with empowerment theory as well, in that, it promotes self-awareness, right, and self-management, as well as social awareness, relationship management, and things like that. We're skipping the self-awareness and self-management. If we can do that and have students, realize not just how to use rhetoric with other people, but to use rhetoric on themselves, what's called internal rhetoric. In fact, I have Jean Ninekamp's book right here. It's a thing, I'm not making it up. Internal rhetoric or interpersonal rhetoric, we can better instill the emotional fortitude and secure base necessary to enter into conversations with an open mind, instead of protecting yourself, from the get-go, right? That does not make for good conversation. So I also see just letting students know the importance of, mindfulness, metacognition, and things like that before getting into understanding the discourse of others, and the preferred discourse of a community or something like that, and then working together with that community to the best of your ability to, for generative purposes, right? To get things done. Those are the kind of things that I use to promote viewpoint diversity.
Yeah, great. Thank you. Yeah, I myself think about social and emotional learning a lot, and how, there's a lot of work to be done with yourself, before you can engage in these conversations. So thank you for that. All right, John, with the Z last name, you're up.
well, these two excellent educators stole a lot of my thunder, but let me just say the way I view this. Basically, the way I summarize it is to promote what they're talking about, you have to change the reading and change the room. So change the reading means, not presenting or not assigning one point of view. And we do that way too often. I try to present people with a multiplicity of authors, people of different backgrounds, and ask them to try to make sense of the differences. But you have to frame it, I think, as Jessica and Eric were saying, in the right way. You just can't say, okay, read these things and tell me which one you like more. You say, well, how do you do that, right? What does it mean to like one more? What's your standard of merit here? What would make one interpretation better than another? And I think that's the sort of, metacognition that was being referred to earlier. Changing the room is harder, but it's possible. So after the 2016 election, I was so appalled by the real absence of political discussion where I taught at Penn, where I'd recently arrived, that what I did was I called up people at Cairn University, formerly Philadelphia Bible College, very different institution with different history and different political profile. And we arranged to bring a group of students up there to talk to students at Cairn, and then a few weeks later have Cairn students come to Penn. And we learned a lot from the enterprise to the point of the need to instruct people. If you just say talk amongst yourselves, that's not going to work. You really do have to structure it. And ultimately what we came up with was what we call the wedding model. So as at a wedding, you come in and you receive a number, which refers to your circular table. And obviously we've staggered those tables, Penn and Cairn. But again, that's a necessary condition. It's not a sufficient one. If you just do that, they won't know what to do. As in a wedding, you need a dais. You know how at a wedding, the couple sits up in front. Well, what we figured out we needed to do was very strategically pick a couple students from each school and have them be up in the dais and ask them at the beginning, okay, tell us who you voted for and why. And we discovered once they did that, and once the people at the wedding tables had done that, they could actually do it. It isn't rocket science. It's just we live in such a brittle, polarized place, we haven't actually witnessed it. And so we don't know what to do. It's like I play tennis, I don't play squash. If you put me on a squash court, I wouldn't know what to do. But if I practice squash a little and I watch some squash players, I know what a racket is, I could do it. And so I think we do have to both change the reading and change the room, but we also have to give people instructions about how to deal with those changes, how to address them.
Yeah, great. Thank you. So your idea of change the room kind of gets to my next question. So we're talking about least and most successful in the classroom. Now I'd like you to think about the school environment. So obviously we have representation from high school and university. So just think about your own school context. So it could be the school you work in within a larger university for the higher ed folks, but how does that need to be structured to cultivate a community of viewpoint diversity? And for this one, I'll let whoever wants to go first take it.
Well, I guess I can go first, since I probably have the shortest answer to that. Like you said, I am in higher ed and not K through 12, so I have a different perspective on this. But regarding your question, I think again of social and emotional learning and how some people do it one way, people do it another way. For example, it can be a one-off activity or it could be systemic throughout the curriculum, right? There are various ways of going about doing that, and that's fine. What I'm seeing, though, not necessarily at my institution, but in the field, that social emotional learning is being usurped by proponents of critical social justice in ways that are kind of antithetical to the original understanding of social and emotional learning. Sometimes there's an adjective attached to this new way of doing it called transformative social and emotional learning, and which shouldn't be a surprise. More than one proponent of CRT will tell you that the point of education is social transformation, right? Not necessarily learning. So this actually, aligns well with what's going on with just transformative social emotional learning. And what transformative SEL is doing all of those things that SEL does, social awareness, self-management and things like that, insofar as they support social justice, right? It's not about, empowerment of the whole person. It's how do we utilize, these proponents of empowerment, these components of empowerment, these competencies of emotional intelligence to put forth equity, diversity, inclusion, social justice, things like that. Even when you look at some of the summaries of transformative SEL, there are some bullet points that are fine, right? Collaborating towards achieving a goal, is one. But what does that really mean? how is it being exercised? I'm hearing horror stories from various people, people I know, people who email me, people who ask me to come to their institutions and talk. There's one right answer you can come to, right? And all the other ones are signs of your complicity in white superiority or something like that. So they're even going against themselves in that, you know, some of their tenants say one thing, but they're really doing something else. So all of that being said, you know, I think SEL is a good thing, but I also see it being used in ways that are counterproductive.
Okay, thank you. Who would
You
like
know, I would
to-
just add that, you know, to take your question, Sam, another easy way to change the room is to bring in more people via your laptop. You know, I mean, there are a lot of bad things that happened during the pandemic, and I mean a lot of bad things. But I think one good thing was, at least for me, is I became more likely to invite people from the outside world into my classroom via my laptop. Of course, there was nothing preventing me from doing that before March 2020. I just hadn't thought about it as much, right? But then suddenly we were all on our laptops. So if everyone's on their laptop, why not bring in somebody else on their laptop? You know, perhaps somebody from a community, an ideological or political community that isn't well represented in the classroom. You know, you don't have to abide by the walls that you're given. And so I've had a lot of success. Just, you know, I read about somebody in the newspaper that I think has an interesting point of view that I haven't heard really elaborated or discussed in my classroom. I just email her or him and ask them to pipe in. And it's pretty magical. It doesn't always work, you know, but it's a great tool to kind of extend the bounds of the physical classroom.
Yeah, and I can actually speak to that as well. I think that was the one amazing thing that came out of the sudden shift to remote learning for the last year and a half, was that there were journalists and writers and academics and researchers who were just more readily available. And so Jonathan and I did the same exact thing. I just started emailing people because if I could do nothing else for my students in that time at home, I was like, I want to connect them to people that they probably would never connect with in any other way in a high school classroom. So I was lucky enough to have a series of speakers, and we would, you know, read their writing and then get to engage with them. And I think the value of that too is it's one thing to have them read their work, but it's another thing entirely to have them speak to them about their viewpoints, you know, like hearing it come from their mouths themselves and being able to engage and ask questions and kind of probe further and ask for clarification and kind of come to a greater understanding. And I think that was something that my students actually really, really loved. And we engaged with people who were very much outside of, you know, the demographics of our school and our community in terms of viewpoints and geography, et cetera. So I completely agree. And that's something that I hope to carry with me, even though we're kind of back into a more traditional classroom setting this year.
Also, I just add something I find both poignant and amusing is when after the Penn Cairn discussions, when we did post hoc interviews with the Penn students, you know, a lot of Penn students said, you know, I'd never talked with a Trump supporter, which is remarkable given that, you know, 70 some odd million people had voted for him. But, you know, they also said, and, you know, I sat at a table with this guy who voted for Trump, and he wasn't an ogre. Like, he didn't have horns or fangs. I didn't agree with him about, you know, abortion or whatever the question was, but, you know, we mostly talked about the Eagles, and he seemed like a pretty good guy. And again, that sounds, I know, very pedestrian and commonplace, but I think in today's environment, actually, it can be quite profound, you know, because we are all encouraged to demonize people that we disagree with. And when you actually see, when you see the contrary and when you experience the contrary, I think in today's environment, it can be really remarkable and powerful.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, so what about the broader environment that you teach within? What kind of, are there standards or norms or something that needs to be set within a school environment to help with these conversations? Or, you know, maybe you can just tell me that, no, you just go it alone and it doesn't really matter. But I suspect that the context matters a lot that classrooms are situated within. Anyone can go with a thought about that.
Well, I just like to, I've been reading the chat as best I can, and I just want to emphasize one really important point that I think has been underscored in the chat, which is that as a full tenured professor at a major research university, I have enormous freedom and, yes, indeed, privilege to bring in anyone I want to my class and say anything I want, have any kind of discussion. I mean, the things I'd have to do to get fired, they're so bad I can't even say them, okay? So, you know, I understand that not everybody is in the same boat, and I think that's a really important point. And I think those of us who want this, we have to be aware of these differences. And really what I'm talking about is the different levels of academic freedom and privilege. And we have to, and we are, try to build a campaign for this kind of discussion. The point that a student of mine raised about 10 years ago, responding to something I wrote, was there's no interest group called People for Debating the Other Side in Schools, right? That's generally not why people enter these political arenas. They enter because they want their point of view privileged, right? You don't see somebody out there on the barricades going, you know, more nuance, more nuance. That doesn't really fit on a poster. But there are people, and they're on this call, who actually want that. And I think the next step is indeed trying to organize that movement. So all of us, not just me, can engage in this kind of activity.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. The difference between academic freedom in higher education and that it, for, you know, mostly is non-existent in K through 12. And so how one situation, you know, university professors approach that is certainly going to be different than K through 12, which, John, you get at a lot in your book, making the case for contention in public schools.
And I should tell you that, you know, I do, you know, teacher and service events and events at schools. And I do think there is this kind of subterranean wish that hasn't been fully articulated for just a better way of talking and conversing and learning. I had this incredible experience a few years ago where I went to a Mennonite school that was in the Philly area, because they were having a difficult time dealing with the question of marriage equality. What's interesting about Mennonites, at least if they're Orthodox Mennonites, is they're pacifists and they don't believe in marriage equality, which is a very interesting combination you won't find almost anywhere else. And they wanted some ideas about how to deal with this, and I gave them some. And then at the end, I said, you know, I think most of all, we have to thank, you know, Ms. whomever, now I'm forgetting her name, who invited me. And everyone clapped. And I looked at this teacher and she was crying. And it was just such a powerful moment for me because, you know, I realized how, you know, how both easy and difficult it is. And I know that sounds odd, but it's difficult because so much in our culture is discouraging this sort of conversation and encouraging us to polarize ourselves and to demonize each other. But at the same time, it's easy. We actually can do it once we've tried, and most of all, once we've witnessed and practiced it.
Eric, were you going to say something?
Well, I know we only have a couple of minutes left, so I just want to, I'm looking at some of the questions in the Q&A directed to me, and I can kind of address most of them with this statement. When I promote viewpoint diversity, I am not saying that all viewpoints are equal. I'm not doing that. What I'm doing is saying with viewpoint diversity, those viewpoints could be on the table and we can discuss or debate, you know, their efficacy. We can't do that if we're only allowing one viewpoint. So when we talk about free Black thought and the compendium and viewpoint diversity, I am not saying, all thoughts and ideologies are created equal. Not doing that. I am saying that we should be able to talk about all ideologies.
Great, thank you that's a good point. So to close out, I'll give you each 1 minute just to say, if you had one piece of advice or takeaway, if you could sum up what you said here, or maybe there's something else that you forgot to mention of how to cultivate a community, so either school community or classroom community of viewpoint diversity, what would your 1 minute response be?
Well, I would like to see it modeled, right? More events where people with opposing views have civil, real and authentic conversations about their viewpoints and go back and forth, and not just make their case, but strong manning the other side in a sense by respecting them enough to listen to them and try to find some common ground if there is any at all. I think we're not seeing that, right? The students aren't seeing that. And I think we need to model how that can look and how that can be.
Great, thank you. Whoever wants to go next.
I could just build off of what Eric was saying. And I think it's also a matter of having confidence within your students that they are capable of this kind of thought, this kind of rigor, and this kind of challenge. And I think they too can become the role models within the school community. And I just say that kind of seeing the transformation within my own students, kind of coming out of the classroom, having spent a year or two kind of thinking this way and engaging this way, they want to take it beyond the classroom. So it influences how they talk to their friends, how they converse with their parents. They've started clubs and organizations within the school to kind of bring this skill set and engagement to the greater school community. So I would just say, have hope in your students that they will, they'll surprise you, and they might be more ready for it and willing to buy into it than you might initially think.
Yeah, that's a great point.
The only thing I would add, just to show my partisan side as nakedly as I can, I'm a liberal Democrat. My fellow liberal Democrats, some of them have not done themselves proud on these grounds. And they've got to speak up for the sort of dialogue and the sort of value that we're describing here. One of the most frustrating things to me about our political landscape is the kind of exchange we're discussing here, and free speech in general in many liberal communities now has been coded as something that's right-wing or conservative. And the last book that I wrote about free speech, which is with Sidney Wilkinson, the cartoonist, was just an effort to remind people about, indeed, the radical roots of free speech in this country. That every great warrior for this thing we call social justice, like, I don't know, Frederick Douglass or Susan B. Anthony or Eugene V. Debs or Martin Luther King, they were all tribunes for free speech and dialogue, because they understood that if you cut that off, you're going to cut them off, and they can't make the case against the circumstances that they found. But unfortunately, I think in many precincts of the left, people have forgotten that, or they're just running scared. And I'm like, person up, my fellow lefties, person up.
Great. Well, that is a fantastic note to end this panel on. So thank you, everyone, for a great session. And I'm going to turn it back over to Ilana.
Hi. All right. Well, that was a great session. So let's turn to session 2, which is called Viewpoint Diversity in Curricula, Introducing Heterodox Perspectives, Critical Thinking, and Art Education. So just give me a minute to transition here.
Hi, I'm John Zimmerman. I teach at the University of Pennsylvania. I'm a historian, and I'm going to be moderating today's panel, which is about viewpoint diversity in curriculum, introducing heterodox perspectives, critical thinking, and art education. We have three terrific scholars and educators joining us today, Samantha Hedges, Ora Itkin, and Erin McLaughlin. And before we get going, I'd just like to ask each of them to introduce themselves briefly. Sam, let's start with yourself.
Yeah, so hello again. I'm Samantha Hedges. I am the K-12 program manager at Heterodox Academy. And as I had mentioned, I've spent all of my adult and really from my teenage years working in education in a variety of different positions.
And Ora?
Hi, I'm Ora Itkin. I'm a musician, and I think that's enough. And you will hear why it's enough for now. You can go on my website www.oraitkin.com and read my story, listen some stuff. But I cannot wait to engage in conversation.
And Erin?
Hi, so I'm Erin McLaughlin, and I am first and foremost an educator. I've taught English literature at the high school level for about 15 years. I'm in my classroom. And I've also worked in school administration to really implement educational initiatives based in positive psychology. In 2019, I founded Positive Ed Consulting to help schools and other organizations integrate strengths-based approaches. And it was this love of learning that I have that actually led me to the Masters of Applied Positive Psychology program at the University of Pennsylvania in 2016. And that's where I met John Haidt and began in earnest my work on viewpoint diversity. So ever since then, I continue to just practice and preach.
Great. So here's the first question that I've got for you all, and perhaps we can go in the same order that we went before, although we'll vary that later on. The question is this: what are your curriculum suggestions and practical advice for other teachers for promoting viewpoint diversity or heterodox perspectives, critical thinking, and/or art education? So Sam, let's start with you.
Yeah, sure. So much of what I'm going to talk about is I will be referring you to our website, Heterodox Academy's website. We have a lot of tools and resources for K-12 educators, including classroom activities, as well as a high school classroom activity series. So how would you use all of the tools and resources we have available? So I'm going to speak from that perspective. And honestly, I'm going to echo a lot of what was talked about in the first panel. So one of the things I think is most important is to set the conditions in the classroom where viewpoint diversity is going to be welcomed, and people aren't going to, or your students are not going to get into fights and arguments and try to shut each other down. And that's really starting by your students getting to know each other on a personal level. So having more, time for them to get to know each other. They may already know each other depending on, how your school is structured. But I think that's really important that they develop that interpersonal relationship, as well as a relationship with you, so it feels like an environment where even if people disagree with them, that they're not going to leave feeling ostracized or upset by what someone has said to them. And then, also kind of the self-awareness side of things. So exploring their own worldview. So doing activities that get them to think about why do they think about an issue in the way that they do. So how were they informed politically, religiously? What kind of neighborhood do they live in? What are their parents' background? Whatever, all of the things that kind of shape your worldview, getting them to think about that and explore that so they understand where they're coming from before they enter into an activity that might have them think about diverse perspectives. And then really, and this is what our Heterodox Academy's high school classroom activity series does is it starts from that level, and then you can move into looking at different issues, the pros and cons of those issues. So engaging in dialectical thinking. And then as time progresses, then you can get into more of them presenting not only their viewpoint, but, you know, being charitable in how they represent the viewpoint of someone else. So, you know, kind of the idea of putting yourself in somebody else's shoes. Why would someone think this way? And what is the best, you know, form of their argument that you can articulate that they would agree with? So that's, you know, kind of the trajectory that would get you to that point is starting with the relationships.
Okay, thank you. We'll go on to Aura.
Well, I would like to bring the main character of a whole conversation, which is missing here. It's the actual child, the actual student, and maybe say a few words about that. I consider myself learning from my students one-on-one and reinventing myself from each one of them. That's why I strongly promote person-to-person learning, passing knowledge from person to person, the long tradition that we seem to be losing more and more. I would like to read something. I promise you will learn about me. So this is, I found it yesterday. It's a program to my project about Spanish artist Francisco Goya. I did it in collaboration with Schubert Club and Museo El Prado in Madrid. It's a very short, that won't take much time. It will help understand where I'm coming from. There are no right or wrong answers. There is no absolute truth except one's own deeply felt experience. There is always a risk and a fear of failure. There is always space for change and a hope to embrace. While recording my observations and experiencing Goya's work, I came to realize that art, music, as well as life itself, cannot be imprisoned in a fancy box of canned ideas and rigid concepts, even if they seem to be convincingly right. So the only conclusion I have is that there are no final conclusions to be made. This is why this project does not aim to become a finished product, but rather a study in progress. I hope this program allows you to launch your own personal journey of questioning, evoking your imagination, facing your fears. In other words, on exploring what it means to be you. So my project, why I teach, and for me, teaching and my own life, my art are inseparable because I'm my own project. I'm a work in progress. And I want to talk about character because I work on my own character, which is constantly, I have to shape it. I have to add more depth to it. And I work on building character with my students at any age, on them finding discovering their own potential. Potential is a big word, and potential of human beings is very messy. It's a mixed bag. We have potential to create, we have potential to destroy. We are rational, but we're deeply irrational. We're creatures of dark impulses, beautiful hopes and aspirations, and how we work with all these elements in us, that's the fascinating, and equalizing them. We talked about dialectics. We are the living embodiment of that dialectics. We are dialectical creatures. And how we work symbiotically and synthetically with each other, one-on-one, collectively, that's my work in progress with myself, with my students, and that's a fascinating work. I think need to be done, especially this time when we lose the depth of the character that Martin Luther King talked about and that William Shakespeare talked about. So I think they would have a fascinating dialogue between the two of them, which I would love to eavesdrop to.
Thank you, Ora. And now Erin.
Okay, so as a teacher, when I'm thinking about what it means to have a viewpoint diversity curriculum, my original idea was that, well, we'll just figure out what the construct is for viewpoint diversity and go from there. And I quickly found out there really wasn't an existing construct for viewpoint diversity. So I went to work kind of figuring out what it really is, you know, what is it so that we could learn how to actually teach it, right? So just kind of starting from there. So what I came up with was that, in my view, it's made up of three things. It's really self-awareness and awareness of other people. It's intellectual humility, which I believe is really the crux of viewpoint diversity. And then it's, I said it's actively seeking out other side arguments, which came from John Barron, who's also at Penn, and that was really his model. So as a teacher, it's like, okay, well, maybe I already know that to be a truly inclusive school, we have to include diversity of thought and diverse viewpoints. But how do we do that practically, right? And what does that look like? And most teachers will say, I can't take any more time out of what I'm doing to do this other thing. And so my thoughts have really shifted quite a bit since I started the work in 2016. And I now really describe viewpoint diversity as a practice and not a program. And I think that's actually the proper way to look at it. It's really not something that you can add on to a class, you know, in any meaningful way. As you know, the retention may be there for a little while, but then it's going to go away like any one-off diversity training, right? So it's really about cultural change more than it is curricular change, which I think is a relief, quite frankly, to many teachers who can't figure out how to fit anything else in where they're already stretched to the max. So I look at viewpoint diversity as a framework for education, a way to put inquiry over advocacy, a way to create a shared language that just to build on what Samantha was saying, this idea of, you know, really getting people to feel comfortable, to be able to talk about their views, because when we close the doors on those views, they don't go away. It's not like, you know, it's not like people aren't expressing themselves in the realms where they feel comfortable. And frankly, minds don't get changed. But viewpoint diversity really isn't about changing minds. And I think that's really important to keep up front. It's really about giving ourselves some space to try to understand perspectives that differ from our own. And quite frankly, it's really, really hard to do. So the way I do it, to kind of get to the answer, I came up with a system that's really practical for teachers. It's on the poster in my classroom, and it's the check method. So it's basically like, if you have a feeling of certainty, you've got to check yourself. And you start with the C, and then the H is for humility, right? And that reminds us that we've been wrong before. And then the E is for evidence. You know, can we seek out, can we go beyond our own personal experience to consider if perhaps complete? We know it's not, but we don't act that way. And then C, and this is where I really like to get into this work, is having constructive conversations, right? And how do we do that? And then even if that conversation fails, you still get the K, which is the knowledge. And you walk away, hopefully, a little more understanding than you were before, or at least with a broadened perspective. And so that's, yeah, that's my way of dealing with it. And that's what I teach to other people.
Oh, thank you. That's excellent. So another question for you all, and maybe we'll go in reverse order this time, just to switch things up a little bit. What would be your suggestion for parents who are homeschooling and want to make sure that you know, their curricular materials, their instruction represents viewpoint diversity? And also, what are your suggestions for parents who want to approach their children's teachers about ensuring viewpoint diversity in the classroom? So what do you advise homeschooling parents, and what do you advise parents in general that, you know, share this concern and want to try to promote viewpoint diversity wherever it is that their kids attend school? So Erin, you want to start us off?
Yeah, of course. So homeschooling poses a big challenge in terms of viewpoint diversity, for sure. I think even many homeschooling parents have networks where their kids are with other homeschooled children. And I think that the propensity for those worldviews to be pretty similar and perspectives to be similar is quite high. So I think that, you know, if parents are really interested in trying to make sure that doesn't happen and they don't, you know, raise their kids in this bubble, they'll literally have to go out of their way to make sure that doesn't happen. So I think there are various ways you can do that, right? And some of them are obvious, like putting your kid on a community team, but maybe there are things that are a little bit different, like community service. Or actually, I'll tell you an idea that I find fascinating. It did get me into a bit of trouble, but that is a story for another day. There was a guy on a podcast, Invisibilia, which I'm sure some of you are familiar with. And his name is escaping me right now, so sorry, guy. But he came up with this randomizer on Facebook. And if you put in a zip code, it would give you this random event. And like, it was sort of like a game you played with yourself. Like you just had to go no matter what you got. You can get some rather dicey things, and I would definitely make sure they're age appropriate. However, like it was a really interesting way to make yourself try things that you wouldn't ordinarily try, you know, and it really did, in my experience, got me to go to some events I never would have gone to. And the thing is, the funny thing about people is that we all think we're pretty open-minded, but not so. And so I think, you know, keeping that up front is important. And for kids, for a curricular idea, I would definitely, if I were homeschooling, I would use current events and try to make sure you're using some kind of media bias checker or look at all sides. I think it's a fascinating thing just to look at how the right and the left report. Right. So maybe doing depending on the age of the kid, obviously, but doing some comparative analysis there so that I think students are, craving to know that there's more than one way to see things. I think in many ways that's a relief because it's hard to always fall in line. And I think that really the whole issue that's happening now comes more from this great desire to belong than it does from any malicious, dark place. I think that people really do want to belong and understand, but somehow we've stepped away from the tools. So when you talk about viewpoint diversity like that, it makes perfect sense that it should be a diversity initiative that schools are involved in. It does not detract from other diversity initiatives, and I will probably die fighting that claim. But I really believe that what it does is it's the gateway diversity. It paves a path to have constructive conversations about difficult topics, which is what the work of diversity work does. So, so to be truly inclusive, I think that's what we have to do. So anyway, I'm getting away from did you have a second part to that question?
No, thank you. Yeah. Thanks very much. And if you look at that, you'll see that the Vox Populi, the great masses are demanding that you unpack the Czech acronym.
Well, they can go to my website. So my website is positive-ed.com. But the deal is, if you go, guys, please sign up for my newsletter.
Good.
If I can make that happen.
Absolutely. Yeah. Aura, advice to homeschoolers and to parents in general about promoting this activity.
I'm a parent myself. I have 2 children, and I'll go back to my childhood because I grew up in former Soviet Union, which long successfully collapsed, but I grew up when it was slowly agonizing. And I lived in a split realm, which I think helped me to build my immunity for, never say never, but I hope so, pretty strong immunity to any sort of groupthink, or I would call it with strong words, any sort of collective psychosis. So if one class I would suggest to implement in new institutions that I hope will be formed soon, it's a history of collective psychosis and how we work with it. Recognizing it and not fall into it. What's the antidote? tune, what was my antidote? Finding something real. And I think we lose connection with the real. We have to reconnect with the real. What's real? For me, the real, it's a real conversation with real people, with real great minds of the past, with great music, with the beauty. Open eyes to the beauty that is already there in the world, because art, and that's what art does. It's a medium that helps us to restore world from its brokenness, from we're incredibly broken, we're all fragmented, and some sort of restoration, that's what art does, we all need. No wonder majority of my students, if I ask them, why you do why you play piano, they say, it keeps us sane. So in an insane world, it's pretty darn difficult thing to remain sane. So in terms of curriculum and what I suggest to parents, tune to your child. I'm using musical words. Tune into your child. Your child knows the answer. Your child is a natural philosopher, because the main word that children bugs you with, it's why, right? All existential questions, that's what children do. And we shut them up through 12 years and they become paralyzed. They're afraid to go to the world. They sit safely in the corner, eat popcorn and play video games. That's what we want. Of course, I'm creating dystopia with my artistic imagination, with hyperbole, right? But I don't think we're far from that dystopian future becomes our new reality, but I believe we can turn the process. Connecting with our children, one-on-one, listening today, what they drive is, what they natural gift, inclination is, because each child is unique and we desperately need more uniqueness. We have to reorient ourselves from collective sameness to collaboration of uniqueness, because we're all colorful, diverse mosaic. I guess that's it. That's what I practice in a classroom, in my family, and with my own lifestyle.
Thank you. Thank you, Aura. Sam, ideas about how to advise homeschoolers or parents in general around these issues?
Yeah, so I would echo some of the things that Erin said, particularly like getting out into the community, team sports, things like that, you know, free play, just kids playing with each other without, you know, the authority of parents being around. That's where they learn to hash out their differences, create rules for games, you know, whatever it is that they have to communicate with each other, and that an adult is not going to solve the problem for them. And then I'd also say, I mean, I'm a big reader. I love good stories. And so I think that's important too. Just reading books from a diverse range of authors that are from different regions of the country, regions of the world, have different backgrounds and perspectives, but good books, you know, make sure they're reading the really high quality, good books, because I think stories, you know, they take you out of your place and put you in somebody else's place, and that can be really helpful. And then just for parents in general, I think part of the question was approaching parents in or teachers in classrooms. I guess I would add in, John, I think this was actually a part of your book, The Case for Contention, you know, some asking teachers how they deal with contentious or controversial issues when they come into the classroom, I think could be really telling. And some schools actually have policies, or some districts have policies about how to deal, like how they're allowed to deal with contentious issues. So that can tell you a lot if you're wanting to know more about what goes on in the school, if you know, you're not a homeschooling parent. And also, you know, just asking for the reading list, why these books were chosen, things like that, in your back to school night or whatever that might be, or just your one-on-one conversations with teachers.
Yeah, the only thing I would add there, since you brought up our book, is the other thing that we discovered, alas, is that although many districts have policies promoting these sort of practices, i.e. addressing controversial issues, if you survey teachers and you ask them, was how to address a controversial issue part of your pre-service training, the vast majority say no. Nobody cued them into this little fact that in fact, in their classroom, these controversial issues were going to arise. And so I think that shouldn't, it's depressing, but it's a reality. And so it also shouldn't surprise us that when you ask students, have controversial issues arisen in your own classroom? Very often they say no. There are, of course, many reasons for that, but I do think we have to address the fact that one of the reasons is that teachers haven't been explicitly prepared to lead those kinds of discussions. Aura, go ahead.
Is it okay to interrupt?
Please, yeah, of course, yeah.
Yeah, I learned to play tennis before I learned to play piano, so that's my first passion. So, and I want to echo Samantha about importance of play, and I would add another word of dramatic play, going back to the origins of drama, right? Back to Greeks. We all dramatic characters, right? We're all acting in the world. That's why I talk about stage. And it's important to play out in a class setting, make a life. Any class can be turned into dramatic theater so students can feel, that's called empathy, original meaning of aesthetic theory, right? Influng, which means in feeling. Historical events, for example, or contradictions or conflicts. We're all dramas and we're all comedies as well. And having ironic scalpel. And that's what another thing we need in our society. We're missing humor. We lost our humor. And humor, satire especially, is merciless knife into the heart of any doctrine or dogma. I truly believe that because I lived it.
So friends, yeah, I've been taking notes here, and I have a kind of follow-up question for all of you that I think is running through this whole discussion is how you make the case for this to people that aren't inclined to engage in it. I think we've all confronted this in different ways. And I think especially right now, a lot of people will say in response to this plea, they'll say viewpoint diversity, I see the problem quite differently. I see that there are terrible viewpoints getting aired out in the world. There are anti-vaccinators and there are racists and sexists, and there are terrible human beings in the world whose viewpoints we should not entertain. In fact, we should either ignore or muzzle. How do you respond to that general critique that, what we actually need isn't viewpoint diversity? What we need to do is to promote good views and to, as best we can, fight bad ones. And anyone wanted any, Aura?
Yes. Well, it brings me back to, you talked about cliches before, how you bring you can bring horse to the water, right? But you cannot make horse drink the water. Well, start drinking it yourself. Make a wonderful potluck, make a feast. Just do it, start cooking. It will have delicious, authentic flavor. That's what people missing. Again, back to real, reconnect real. And I'm sure that aroma of deliciousness, of provocative, fresh, diverse, naturally, organically diverse, because world is diverse, will bring people in because they won't resist.
Well, look, Aura, I'll be honest with you, I would love to agree with you. And I think that, you made a very eloquent plea right there, but I just wonder about how it's going to persuade people of a different orientation. And this is really my issue with Heterodox Academy. I'm a proud member and one of the founding members of HxA. They were kind enough to give me a leadership award. But, HxA, like a friend of mine says, it's a herd of independent thinking minds. Everyone is on this call because they believe in this thing called viewpoint diversity. And none of them need persuasion, right? It's other people who do.
Let me give you an example.
Sure.
I'm Israeli citizen. I'm a wandering Jew, I call myself, a wandering Jew who wanders, trying to figure things out, which I haven't yet. So I have a lot of friends who are Muslims, right? And we supposedly have to be enemies, right? And guess what? We start from the point where we are at, from the point, what is it we share? We share our love of humus. So we start from humus. We don't start from diversity of our views. We start from, okay, what we share. And I think we should start looking for those points of connections that we share, which call our shared humanity, right? Where they are. And maybe go down to earth more.
Again,
before we start branching.
No argument from me, but this is what you hear where I work. The real problem in America is about half of America doesn't believe that I have humanity. And again, this isn't me talking. These are my colleagues talking, right? Or is making a plea for shared humanity. That's all fine and good. But we live in a nation where millions of people don't regard some of their countrymen or women as humans for starters. How are you going to create shared humanity on those grounds? I mean, that's what I hear. Erin or Sam, do you want to jump in here, how you make this case?
Well, I mean, I've been making this case for a long time, I feel like. Viewpoint diversity, the people who oppose it tend to oppose it because they think they're right, which actually flies in the face of the main tenet of viewpoint diversity, which is acknowledging that you might in fact be wrong. But being wrong hurts, people don't want their worldviews shattered. And so my advice is maybe a little different than a lot of people who are proponents of viewpoint diversity, because I really do take the positive psychology approach here, and I try to find a constructive path forward. I think I'm a big fan of Ted Lasso. So I hope you're tuning in, but Ted Lasso, he goes through this whole episode and says he actually misattributes the quote to Walt Whitman, but it doesn't matter. It's be curious, not judgmental. And I really think that's it in a nutshell. The people, I don't think people are as wholly bad. Maybe I'm ridiculously optimistic, but I don't. I think that there's a lot of, I think identity politics plays a huge part in this. But again, it comes from that wanting to belong, and it's a little scary to be wrong, or to find out that the things you believe are not actually maybe true. And so I think just being gentle with people might be nice. And by the way, I think this on both sides, right and left, I don't think we're very good at taking the generous view of each other. And so the truth is, some people just won't want to, and you're not going to reach those people because they've already decided. And I think that is true, but I don't think that's true for the majority. I think people are trying to find a constructive path forward. I think our work is to help explain how viewpoint diversity does not negate any of these other really good initiatives and efforts to bring people together and help them understand each other. It's actually the most fundamental groundwork that in order to do that other heavy lifting. So, I mean, that's how I talk about it. I don't get a ton of pushback if I'm with people who are willing to hear me out, but
Yeah, that's the rub. Yeah. Sam, you want to add to that?
Yeah, so I mean, I guess I just think, I don't know, convincing people, it's not necessarily the path forward, try to convince them why viewpoint diversity is important. It's more the experience of it. So I just think about like people who love to travel, love to go to museums, love to read books, whatever it might be, where they're putting themselves in a situation where they're learning something from someone else. They are interested in viewpoint diversity. That is, learning about the life of somebody else's perspective. So I think it's there, but we put it in these terms of political. When we talk about it, it's like, well, how do we get people from left and right to come together? And I just think in general in people's lives, they're interested in learning other new things from other people. And so they're open to the idea, and really, kind of the way into engaging in a conversation with someone who thinks differently than you is just asking questions. And it's like, I'll there's this idea of the lived experience that gets, people have opinions about what that phrase means or whatever, but there are instances where somebody who doesn't agree with you, you can be like, oh, well, this is, I traveled to such and such country, or I spoke with such and such person, or I'm from the Midwest. Like, I currently live in New York. I'm from the Midwest. This is how people, in my culture think about these things. Just kind of taking it maybe away from yourself and positioning it into something else. But I think in asking questions like, what makes you think that, that's not my experience, like, why is that your experience? But I really think it goes back to people like to learn. We do a lot of things that put us in a position to learn. And so I don't think if we stop framing it so much in political terms, it might be easier to get people to understand that they actually do enjoy viewpoint diversity.
Interesting. Ora, were you going to add something?
Yeah. Do I have time? If no, no. So continuing, I think it's important when we talk about process of restoration of the real, right? I'm pointing back to real. It's very important to restore communities, creative communities, let's say around orchestra playing or singing together or gardening together. And when you go to the orchestra rehearsal, you have to leave your political views and opinions, guess where? In a dressing room, right? So we need more activities like that, where we are unpoliticized activities, where we come to harmonize our coexistence in real time. That's why theater, music, singing, even sport events, any creative events is cooking together, cooking classes, anything which involves whole body of the person is essential, because we're disconnecting from realities. We inflate our virtual, it's largely inflated, our antagonism, hyperbolized by digital reality. I'm strongly convinced of this. It's in pandemic propelled it to magnitudes, unimaginable magnitudes. We're much more shared more in common than we think we are. And it's a whole different area we have to address, what media does and technology does, but it's not for this conversation.
Yeah, well, I mean, two things that came up that I just want to underscore. I mean, the first, getting back to what Sam was saying, I think that, we're a politicized society right now and hyper polarized, but that doesn't mean that people like it. And in fact, one of the things that give me hope in the poll literature, despite the fact that people express so much enmity towards the other team, they also say they don't like the political environment, which is really an interesting tension when you think about it. So, people say, no, I don't want to be friends with somebody in the other party. I don't want to date somebody in the other party. Have my kid do that. Then you ask them, like, how do you like the political environment? And virtually the only thing that red and blue agree on is they don't like it, which is really interesting, and I think that does point to the reality of what all of you are saying, which is that this is possible and people really do desire it, right? It's I think, a question of tapping into that, and sometimes just the wedge that you use. I mean, that's the other thing that I've learned from listening to you all. It reminds me of a very dear friend of mine who's a pilot, actually now an ex-pilot, because sadly he got ill. But because he's been ill, I've spent a lot of time talking with him about being a pilot. And especially after 9/11, it was not uncommon that there would be some conflagration in the cabin with an angry, an angry air traveler, and the pilot gets called out to deal with it. And he said the biggest mistake you can make when you go into a situation like that is say, what's the problem here? And what you should do is just say, excuse me, sir, because it's always a guy, of course, that's having the problem. Can I help you? And my friend told me that just the difference in that wedge, in that entry, is enormous. Because if you begin with the question, what's the problem? In some ways, you're underscoring the presence of one, and you're retaining that conflictual frame. But if you begin just by, hello, sir, how can I help you today? That it just makes an enormous difference. And perhaps that's something all of us have to do, is kind of find those wedges, those questions that underscore, commonality, mutual assistance, whatever it might be, and divert us away from the conflicts, which are real and obviously in the front of our lobes, but perhaps we don't have to be reminded of them all the time. And somebody just pointed out sports there. Closing comments from anybody? We have only about a minute left. Anything that any of you would like to add? Erin?
Oh, I'm sorry. I was thinking as you were telling the story about the pilot, it reminded me of something I came across that I just thought was really good. And I think it was Brene Brown. I can't even remember, but it was just a question. Just can you help me, see what I'm missing about your perspective? Like just a question. And I really like that. I teach it to my students and we use it. I think that what I am seeing personally in the classroom is that the kids do not like cancel culture. That's not to say they don't use it, but they don't like it. I think it's a really scary thing, actually. And I think they also find it scary. It's kind of like, it's kind of that bully thing. Like you're just glad it's not happening to you. And that's sort of what it's about. And I really don't view, one of the best questions, and hopefully we'll get to this in the Q&As, is where do you draw the line, right, on viewpoint diversity? And it's a really good question. And I see someone just wrote about Irshad Manji, who wrote Don't Label Me, which is a great book too. But anyway, that just popped up as I was talking. I just think that, I guess my closing statement is that I don't think there's as much opposition to viewpoint diversity if it's properly understood as most people think. And I don't think that it's nearly as scary as a lot of the other things that are out there right now. So that's my closing statement.
Sam, something to close with?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I'm listening to, the story about the pilot and just thinking about, advice that has come in this panel and then the previous one is relationships are really important. Like, so I can talk to people in my life about the importance of viewpoint diversity, and some of them would disagree with me, but they like me. They're my friends, they're my family. They're not going to, throw me to the curb just because I have a view that differs from theirs. And so I think those relationships come before anything else when you're trying to either express a viewpoint that is divergent, maybe one that you don't even hold, but you want to represent somebody else's, or just trying to persuade your fellow friends, family, colleagues that viewpoint diversity is important.
Thank you. Ora?
Yes, I've seen comment from Eric, I believe, about effectiveness of collaborative work. Collaboration means laboring together, giving birth to something. I always tell my students jokingly, it takes 9 months for a baby to be born. So I believe we have to revive the slow form. And if we remember the meaning of word school, it's a place of conversation. So we have to restore slowly unfolding conversation, which we develop. It's not from one day to the next day. And maybe some people need some introduction. People need exposition to get into things. And then they open up, and then we find this point of intersection where we can challenge each other gently. There was gentleness, right? Step by step, drip by drip. And maybe we won't have to make more efforts to persuade somebody. Well, persuasion is another thing. But again, persuasion is a slow process. So reconsider importance of slow, step-by-step unfolding process, which is practice.
Well, I think that's probably a great place to conclude. I want to thank all three of our terrific panelists, not just for their comments, but for their commitment to this process that Ora was referring to. It's ongoing. We all know that it's challenging, but I took away some really good pointers, really about ways to frame it that I'm going to be thinking about for a while. So thanks to all of you. And I think now we go, I think we'll wait for Chairwoman Ilana. There she is.
Yeah, thank you. So hold on one second. Yeah, no, so that's great. Thank you. We're going to turn now to our third session. I'm going to just transition the spotlights. This session is sponsored by the Educational Liberty Alliance. It will consist of a moderated discussion about whether K-12 teachers should advocate for social justice causes in the classroom. So give me just a moment to make that transition.
All right. Hi, I'm Graham Gerst, founder of the Educational Liberty Alliance. We are dedicated to helping people organize and push for diversity of thought in K-12 schools. Along the lines of Eric's comments from the first panel, we're going to try to model a discussion with opposing viewpoints, which hopefully will provide insight into the issue that we are discussing. Our topic, as Ilana said, is whether teachers should advocate for social justice in the K-12 classroom. Traditionalists instinctively say no, while those of a more progressive bent are often in favor of it. I'll introduce today's panel only briefly because of our limited time, but their impressive credentials are found on the conference website. First, we have Garry Mitchell. He's a doctoral student at Harvard Graduate School of Education and a Stone PhD scholar in inequality and wealth concentration through the Kennedy School. He previously worked as a middle school English and history teacher in New York City. Garry considers his research commitment to educational justice inextricably linked to his identity as an African-American male descended from enslaved peoples in the United States, alongside his professional identity as a teacher and pedagogue. Tony Kinnett, our second panelist, is the founder of the Chalkboard Review Education Journal. He has a master's in curriculum development and education technology from Ball State University and is taught in schools from inner city Milwaukee and Indianapolis to rural Wisconsin and Indiana. He is currently the science coordinator for the Indianapolis Public Schools system. So let's get started, gentlemen. First, we need to define social justice advocacy. A fair start seems to be that social justice advocacy refers to calls for changes to institutional policies or laws to achieve something. But what is that something? Garry, I'd like to start with you. What are some examples of social justice causes you've seen advocated for in the classroom? And how would you characterize what that something is that social justice is trying to achieve?
Yeah, thanks so much, Graham. I'm excited to be here. So I'll use an example from my own classroom. When I taught 5th grade in New York, I just so happened to be teaching at an all-girls school at in this particular example. But one of the things that we did was we had a whole unit on migration. And so, you know, we studied some of the more traditional forms of migration of peoples that we think about, migrating from, you know, one country to another. But we also focused on forms of migration that were maybe more familiar and more current to some of my students living in Brooklyn. And so one of the things that we talked about was gentrification. And through focusing on gentrification, we were able to focus more broadly and explore more broadly other forms of displacement. And so one social justice issue that we were able to grapple with then was the social justice issue of forced displacement. And I think that the goal of focusing on that and discussing that with my students as it relates to social justice is making sure that students understand aspects and elements of fairness, aspects and elements of inclusion and belonging. And there's a lot of other sort of tentacles that has, but to be succinct, that's what I'd say as an example from my classroom.
And just quickly to follow up, when you say forced displacement, what are you referring to? And what is kind of the commonality that you think different social justice causes have?
Yeah, so forced displacement were instances of people being moved from their homes, areas, or regions or being coerced out of their homes, areas, or regions for any number of reasons. You know, it might be economic factors, it might be due to violence in the area. And so those were some of the issues that we grappled with in that unit. And then talking about social justice, could you repeat that second part of the question?
So just what's kind of the common characteristic? What is the, you know, as I originally framed it, what is that something? We talk about social justice being advocating for changes to laws and policies, but what's the ultimate goal?
In my view, I think the ultimate goal of advocating for social justice is to create a society in which we are not only bringing people in from the margins, but we're also expanding the center and making a society that is more representative, reflective, and inclusive of all people, but especially for those who have traditionally been on the margins.
Tony, let's get your perspective of what are some examples that you've seen in the classroom or read about, and how would you characterize the something that these social justice causes are trying to achieve generally?
So in order to kind of take a look at social justice causes over the last couple of years in classrooms, I really like to take kind of an open framework of the specific instances of things that have been reported on that teachers often discuss in professional developments, things that students usually tend to remember, of things that were maybe outside of the content knowledge or academic standards that have been really hit home on by the educator. Kind of when the teacher says, stop, let's take a look at these different issues and the combinations of them. So in the last 5 to 10 years, these have come under certain kinds of frameworks, like the importance of incorporating slavery reparations, free public housing, racial and gender quotas, as Garry stated, gentrification and collective financial issues, calling for the abolition of Western civilization principles under the guise of decentralizing whiteness, promoting Black Lives Matter protests and riots, adhering to the 1619 Project, hypersexualized education in elementary classrooms, and issues suggesting that national and global problems lay at the feet of a specific racial and sexual group. And the reason that I would characterize all of those as social justice issues is because this something to achieve in social justice is all built around closing perceived gaps in outcomes that have to be caused by harmful actions of another group, often with little statistical data proof other than that the gap exists, therefore there must be some type of malicious intent and action. That's why it's social justice and not advocating specifically for justice. Advocating for justice means every individual is treated equally and fairly under the law, whereas social justice says that's not getting the job done. And so therefore we have to advocate for other means in order to solve those societal issues that we see present via historical or present collective gaps.
So you've both come up with with kind of definitions of what you think that something is that is the commonality for social justice. But there are two different conceptions, and I don't know that we sort of have a societal consensus around it. Equally, it seems that both of the definitions you came up with are fairly broad and could encompass a lot of things, which would seem to give, if we give teachers and administrators license to advocate for social justice, it would seem to give them the ability to select which causes they deem appropriate. Is that discretion concerning, or do we trust our educators to make those decisions about which causes to advocate? Tony, why don't you go first on this one?
I think that's really the key issue here is it really matters the size. Excuse me, my cat's being very excited about the piano. I think that the key issue here to consider is that really who's swinging the bat of deciding what issues to discuss is incredibly important to discuss. I don't really want someone with my complete opposite political views telling my child how they should think or feel about certain issues. And vice versa, someone who has completely opposite political views from me probably doesn't want me giving all of my students my unique perspective on history and all of the opinions that come with it. And that's really key to this conversation. And that's something that we need to keep in mind, is that anytime we give someone power to do something, once the power changes hands to someone who I may disagree with, that becomes a key issue.
Garry, following up, we obviously give teachers a lot of leeway over how to present things in the classroom, for example. do we trust our educators for these sorts of decisions about what's appropriate, or are we concerned about, or are you concerned about that type of discretion?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think it depends on what it is that we're talking about educators doing. If we're talking about educators presenting students with issues and encouraging them to become more knowledgeable around the issues, I think that that's one thing. Sorry, my lights went off in the background. I think the other thing, though, is if we're talking about having a sort of indoctrination of sorts around a particular issue and an outcome from that issue, I think that that would lead me to answer differently. I think what's really important in the way that I see it is that there are groups of people, many of whom, I mean, all of whom, because schools are one of the only compulsory institutions that we have in our society, we see our students represent everyone, right? And because of that, it's important for us to make sure that in the classroom, we are recognizing all of our students' humanity. And part of that involves, I think, condemning certain things and making sure that certain things are not on the table. That doesn't mean that you're telling students exactly how to act or how to respond to those things not being on the table, or to those sort of what I think might be universally condemnable actions or ways of thinking and being. But I do think what is important is that we're allowing students to sort of form and develop specific actions and outcomes on their own with some guidance perhaps. But I don't think what I'm interested in arguing is that teachers should necessarily or always be leading students all the way from point A to point Z in terms of, you know, social justice causes and specific actions.
That's helpful. Let's shift a little bit. I think it would be helpful in the discussion to understand what we think K through 12 education should be trying to foster and develop in students. Garry, why don't you start us off on this one?
Yeah, so I tend to believe quite strongly in the civic purposes of education. Education, in my mind, should be about creating a better society and preparing individuals to make society better. And I think part of that is them helping students become their best selves as well. And so I think a lot of what I view as social justice in the classroom sort of revolves around my stipulation that good educators and good education helps prepare students to repair the world and bring it closer to what ideally we would like for it to be, sort of, you know, in a normative sense.
And when you say better prepare students to repair the world, I think is the phrase you used. What do you mean by that, and how do you prepare the students to do that?
Yeah, I think, you know, Tony identified and talked about some gaps that we see in society and in the world. I think that a lot of those gaps, the gap is sort of the manifestation of an underlying issue. And one of the things that I see as important is having students prepared to address those root causes. Well, first being able to identify what those root causes are, and then being prepared to remediate them and address them.
Tony, what's your response? What are the things that you think a K through 12 education should be seeking to foster, and in terms of what Garry's saying about sort of trying to getting students to address root causes? How does that play into that?
Yeah, so I would believe that through most of my research, and obviously my growth as a teacher, I'm much different than the first time that I set foot in a classroom. At the present time, I believe the highest goal of American K-12 education should be to prepare its students to be the most successful at wielding the three fundamental rights that we all have: life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. To wield these properly, we have to have a firm grasp on the functional, vocational skills to work in our economy. We need an academic and accurate understanding of our history, a solid framework of what makes a man or woman, his and her rights, and then the philosophy behind those. And then, of course, an appreciation of the virtues that govern a functional society, which often comes through the beauty of, let's say, the arts. So a substantive knowledge without virtue, vocational training, and philosophy creates a hopeless nihilist tomb to seek authoritative Machiavellianism as a savior. And skills without values could leave a person absent of purpose. So it matters little what my students could make in a future economy if they don't really want to have anything to do with it. You know, entertainment, pleasure, and gluttony don't fulfill someone indefinitely. Teaching students a series of values without a comprehensive tool belt of skills and virtue cripples the student post-graduation. So we see this really with a lot of Chicago and LA graduates right now who statistically really don't have an ability to read past a second grade level, but could tell you many aspects of social emotional learning. So how are they supposed to keep a job and rear a family? And this really correlates to what Garry is saying as far as repairing the world. I would question the authority of really anyone in education to define certain issues that need to be brought to the table. And really in recognizing historical gaps and what the solutions are to those gaps. As a teacher, it's very easy for me to select which information I want my students to see regarding repairing certain historical situations or gaps in general. Therefore, it's really incredibly important that when I'm talking about the value of education, that it's done through the objective lens that, as Garry said, students have to become better people and they have to go out and they have to make the society a better place. I think that it's perhaps just a little more centered on kind of the classical Western civilization ideas and values of individualism.
So, yeah, so one of the things you bring up that the school should inculcate are values of some kind. And if that's the case, how do we determine, particularly in our current society where different people, I think, probably have different value systems, how do we determine which values the school should be using in the school system? Who should be making that determination? This is just to follow up to Tony, to what you were saying earlier.
So this is really the tough one, right? So how the state is in charge of public education, which means that I, as a taxpayer, am responsible for giving a certain amount of knowledge to the kids in my community, which means that I'm responsible for what values are being taught to those kids. Therefore, I really would suggest kind of a minimalist approach to how the state is teaching values, encouraging things like family and the home, make sure that we're keeping our parents really at the top as far as teaching values to our students. Now, of course, that's not going to completely cut it. Education doesn't come without virtue. It doesn't come without an understanding of beauty and value. I would suggest that there are some values that are objectively better than others. And within that, within the last 10 years or so, we've seen quite a divergence in education in K through 12. We've seen a suggestion that one of the best ways to go about life is with an extreme adherence to the collective, to the group, and that all of your virtues and all of your sins come from that identity. And I disagree. I think that's objectively a worse way to go about teaching a student rather than focusing on individualism, which Western civilization was built upon and thrived through.
So Garry, let's get your thoughts on this. And so we're talking about the schools, K through 12 schools fostering values. I think Tony set forth a set of values that he thinks, albeit a kind of a minimalist set of them, but a set of values that he thinks the school should be inculcating in the students. What are your thoughts on this issue? What should schools be using and fostering values in students, and if so, which ones?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that schools should be fostering values in students. I think where I diverge from Tony's perspective is that I think I'm kind of on the other end of things. I think while there's an importance in focusing on individualism as well, I think that the collective should be the priority. And I think that part of that is from my personal lens, and also from it's from the lens of being a teacher who worked in schools where many of my students aren't sort of afforded the lens of individualism, because that's not necessarily how society views them. And I also think sort of like, regardless of how society might view me or my students, I think that there's a lot of beauty in collectivism and prioritizing that as one of the values. I also think, we hear the terms equality and equity kind of brought into conversations a lot. I think that equity specific, the way that I think of equity is not necessarily giving everyone the same thing, but giving different demographics what it is that they need to fulfill their purpose, or maybe a broader collective purpose. And I think that that is one of the values that in a lot of my work, I propone and promote. And then that's one of the values that I try to work through with my students a lot when I was in the classroom as well.
So it sounds like the two of you, and this is granted a somewhat superficial discussion with limited time, but you know, I think just sort of hearing it in this brief venue, in this brief opportunity, it almost sounds like the two of you are in a lot of ways diametrically opposed on what the value should be taught. I mean, on the one hand, you got Tony who's pushing for a very individualistic priority, and you, Garry, are talking about more of a collective. I suspect that if we had more time and you were looking at this like a Venn diagram, the two circles would have some overlap, but also have a lot of portions that are on either side. If this is going to end up being contentious on kind of both ends that are excluded from each other's circles, how do we get some sort of consensus on what values the school should be teaching? This is like to you, Garry, back to you.
Yeah, that's a really great question. I think some people would, and Tony might feel this way, I'm not sure. But I think some people would say that, you know, we're not going to find consensus. And so the way to sort of approach that and navigate that is by teaching things that are uncontroversial, and maybe assuming a sort of neutrality, reading, writing, arithmetic, being some of the examples of things that are neutral. I personally don't necessarily feel that way. I think that even things that are now taken as sort of fundamental fact, fundamental knowledge, and viewed as neutral are still incredibly laden with values. They've been constructed in a way throughout history that have sort of brought certain groups to the fore, certain individuals to the fore, even to the exclusion of others. And so I think that without agreeing on sort of a movement towards collectivism, towards inclusion, I think then we maintain the status quo. And if we sort of agree as, you know, educators that where it is that we've been for the last several hundred years is a place that we're excited about, or think has been in the best interest of our children, then I think that, you know, we should probably continue doing things the way that they've been done. If, however, we're interested in building a society that does not sort of place certain students on pedestals at the exclusion of others, I think we might need to rethink some things.
Tony, what's your reaction? How do we decide which are the values we're going to use in the schools?
Well, Garry, you had me until like the last 10%. I'm absolutely in agreement that if people who are more individualistic and people who are more based toward the collective are going to work together in a public school system, then it needs to be done from an unbiased as possible lens in a very neutral fashion. I think that's a good compromise. That's certainly not how I would like to personally go about seeing things. And you also indicated that's certainly not how you'd like to personally go about seeing things, but that is a good compromise. I would very much so disagree that kind of approaching things from a neutral perspective is the status quo. American education has not followed that perspective in the last 100 years in a lot of ways, especially when you take a look at civics education. Of course, the civil rights movement fought very hard to make sure that there were certain individualistic values that every person had regardless of color. And that is a fundamental good that we teach in our classroom. That's not necessarily neutral, and that is very individualistic. Of course, there are going to be some differences regarding, you know, teaching civil rights to our students. The perspectives of Dr. King and Malcolm X are very, very different, one based towards individualism and one based toward the collective. But I would suggest that it's not a status quo kind of idea to treat your classroom in a neutral sense. For example, in my science classroom, I made a very concerted effort to keep my opinion out of the material. This happens a lot during environmental science. You start discussing the different types of energy and politics hops in really quick. I tried to keep my personal feelings and whether one would suit collectivism or individualism really out of the process so that my students could learn those effectively. And that's very unlike how many public education classrooms are like today. They have been opinionated. Being opinionated in classrooms is the status quo.
Let me ask this. I mean, we're talking about values in the schools, and we also want to encourage independent thought. Is there any potential conflict there? I mean, are we encouraging students to make their own decisions about what values they want to incorporate into their own lives? Garry, why don't you go first with this one?
I think that, you know, in an ideal world, we might be leading students towards a buffet of values, and not necessarily, what I do think is that it's not best for children for us to tell them which values are the ones that they should sort of hold above all others. But I do think that we should point them towards this buffet of values and encourage them to hold some very near and dear to themselves. I think we can show them through the selection of materials and resources what sort of placing some values over others, how that's resulted for certain people throughout history. But I think that to tell them that this value is the one that they must hold dear might be a little outside of our purview in an instructional space. And I know we haven't necessarily gotten into schools as more than instructional spaces, but I might answer that question a little bit differently if we're talking about, a setting within a school that, falls outside of, classroom instructional time.
Mm-hmm. Tony, any thoughts?
I'm more than happy with presenting students with a very fact-based view of history and then letting them derive the values that they see from it. I have no problem with showing my students, the horrors of Nazi Germany and what that ideology did, and also the horrors of communism and what that ideology did, and the millions that both ideologies left dead. I don't have a problem with showing my students kind of the focus of, at length collectivism and showing how it ruined France for more than 100 years. And showing them that through individualism, that through history, certain things came to pass. I would caution the idea of just giving students kind of a smorgasbord of values and then saying, go pick one. They're kids, and kids have pretty poor judgment. I really enjoy getting to work with a lot of kids who want candy all the time. And I'm sure that we could give students candy for dinner and say that certain value systems, you pick which one you want. Obviously, the kid's going to go eat the candy. That doesn't necessarily mean it's best for them. I do think there are some value systems that are objectively better than others. And by objectively, I mean that can fit into instructional time. Objective values that at the end of the day do not encroach on the rights of a person. As soon as something encroaches on a right, it becomes a negative impact on any value system. So I think that it does play a little into instruction time.
Now,
hey, Graham, just really quickly. I agree with what you said there, Tony. And I just want to make sure that it's clear that I wasn't, part of what I was saying was that it is important for us to sort of lay out for students the benefits or maybe drawbacks of different value systems.
Sure.
As evidenced by different, events in history. And I think that we're in agreement there. I think the one thing that I would say is that it's also important for us to, I guess I'd like to hear more a little bit about what you said about helping students understand that there are some value systems that are objectively better, because I actually really agreed with that. And I'm wondering, it feels maybe slightly contradictory to some of the other things that you voiced earlier.
Yeah, Tony,
we good? Yeah, absolutely. So when I suggest that we should be teaching that some value systems are objectively better, I am talking about the fundamentals that built Western civilization. I am suggesting that the Western civilization that focused primarily on the foundations of justice, pure and simple with no additives, that's really what I'm focusing on, and finding that through the beauty of the arts. You're never going to get education to a space where it can be completely unbiased. It can't happen. There is no law that we can pass. There are no amount of cameras in classrooms that are going to keep every teacher so obsessively neutral that they're not going to get any moral value system from that class. And while I can show a series of, good things and bad things and give students the opportunity to pick, at the end of the day, some of my moral virtue and value is going to shine through in the classroom. And so while I think that aiming towards neutrality is a good thing, and I think that is where I would like to make that compromise towards and really head in that direction, I am making the case that it's not always going to be that way. And so if I have to pick between a situation of where the person is going to tell their students that certain things are objectively good and objectively not good, then I want to make sure that the teacher in that situation is laying those out in a neutral fashion.
Let me take a shift a little bit back from values generally to social justice. So, when we get started, we talk about how social justice is calling for changes to laws and institutions that have developed through the democratic process. Often those laws do need to be changed because they're flawed for a variety of reasons. I mean, outlawing legalized discrimination during the civil rights era is a terrific example of that. Is enlisting students, and Garry, maybe this gets to your comment earlier about repairing the world, so I'll start with you. Is enlisting students an appropriate way to get those changes made?
I think it depends on what you mean by enlisting. I think bringing students into some of those discussions is a really important step for us to take. I think that given that, all of our time is finite, but children, just by the nature of the way that the world works, we would hope that they'd have a little bit more time than us. And so the future is theirs. And so I'd like to think that it's important for us to help get students on board in terms of what it might look like to repair our society and to make it more inclusive, to make it a better society. I think that enlisting them, for a long time, we've had students writing their, local Congress people and local representatives. I think those types of activities are important. I think that what it might look like in terms of enlisting students is enlisting them to form an opinion and then to take action. I think we can sort of, I'm going back to the earlier panel where someone said, the old cliche of leading the horse to water. But, I think maybe taking off from there and letting students move in the way that they feel that they need to at that point. I do think though, however, I take a little bit less issue with involving students in maybe specific causes around social justice, because I think, Tony, you and I might disagree on the idea of neutrality. And I think that there is not necessary. I think that neutral space is a lot smaller than we tend to think it is. And so I think that by remaining silent or leaving certain things outside of the classroom space, what we're not exercising is neutrality. What we're exercising is sort of the status quo or maintenance, especially when we're talking about social justice. So I'll pause there.
So Tony, what about that? What about involving students in social justice causes as a teacher or an administrator?
Garry, I find the last thing that you said really interesting, and the idea that silence and what can be kept out of classroom discussion could be considered as bias towards that event. I would caution that providing a certain emotionally charged topic to the classroom for my students to kind of be whipped up into a frenzy, as students are wont to do, is a very dangerous thing. And putting my students in an environment where I tell them that it's good for them to discuss things and get, in a lot of cases, as we've seen in a lot of these social justice advocacy cases, students are encouraged to discuss the topic, to kind of whip themselves up into a frenzy. And then you have this very strange mob-esque mentality in the classroom. So in two schools pop into my mind, one in Manhattan and one in Philadelphia, in which they were talking about a lot of the Black Lives Matter protests and kind of the things that played into the death of George Floyd. And within this classroom setting, there were students in both classrooms who dissented, who didn't agree, who didn't like where this was going. And the other students in the classroom ended up shouting these particular students down until they were forced to admit that they agreed with the majority. And I think that sometimes it is more appropriate to limit the big class-wide discussion as though these are all rational and reasonable adults who aren't going to be whipped up into a frenzy. And what I have concerns of is when we start enlisting students not to consider things, but to take action. I don't think that I should ever be in a position to tell my students to go take action. That is a very aggressive thing to request someone to do. Enlisting them in any kind of activity first of all, it makes me responsible for their actions. And in a secondary nature, they're children. They're not going to make decisions based on all of the information and all of the facts ever, from a kindergartner through a student in high school. And so whether it's something on the right or something on the left, I would be very cautious about bringing some things to the classroom to an open forum discussion, only because students can, once a few loud voices start, moving along, things can get out of hand pretty quickly.
Garry, just real quick. So, I mean, you seemed open to involving students in social justice causes. You talked earlier about encouraging students to write to their respective Congress, their senators or their legislative representatives. Are you generally open to encouraging teachers encouraging students to take action? Or is there some sort of line where you sort of shift from the letter writing to something else?
Got it. So I think that letter writing is one way of taking action. I also think that I personally believe that, the old adage, actions speak louder than words, is a really important one. I think that, part of what I've experienced in my lifetime, and I kind of agree with you, Tony, these conversations are important, but they do kind of, they work students up. And I think part of what we can do is minimize the working up that happens in these conversations, and encourage students to move to action. What those actions are things that we can sort of guide and we can help students with. I mean, I think if you use I think a lot of education at some point, what it pushes towards is some sort of application of that education, right? Our students might very well cut themselves while they're dissecting, in science class, but instead of saying, well, we think dissection should be off the table, at least what I've seen people do is set up certain norms, set up safety procedures so that students can engage in those activities without hurting themselves, without hurting other people. And I think similarly, we can set up certain norms, we can put parameters, and we can train our teachers to be people who can facilitate those conversations, right? And so I think the same way that not every teacher might be skilled at leading students through a dissection, not every teacher is going to be skilled at leading students through these conversations. And I think that that might be an important distinction for us to make. And so that's one of the things that I wanted to put out there. In terms of enlisting students to take action, I personally think that just because students might do something sloppily or might not do things the way that adults would do it, does not mean that we should prohibit them from doing it at all. I think that it's important for students, if they're going to be the leaders of our society and our future society, that they are allowed to sort of have messy engagements and take action in ways that might not be the cleanest. But I also think that it's important for us to guide them through that and for it to be a scaffolded process. So what I'm not advocating for is like, we're going to go to a protest, choose a side, y'all. I'm going to be standing back here. I'll meet you back at the classroom in an hour.
Sure.
That's not what I'm advocating for. And I don't think any good teacher would. But what I am saying is that I think that, if we're building students to be empathetic human beings, which maybe we disagree on whether or not that should be something that we should try to promote or prompt in students, but it would almost be disingenuous for them to not want to take action if we're, sort of reviewing things that have happened in history, are currently happening to them and their classmates, to just kind of intellectualize it and then leave it, and stop there. I think that might be a little bit, that might be too much for me to do as an educator. I'll just say that.
So I just want to respond in two quick things here. So first of all, I am absolutely all for encouraging empathy. We holistically agree on that. Wholeheartedly agree on that. I'm all for making sure that my students understand that based on the set of shoes you're wearing, things can be very different. And we need to understand people are coming from very different backgrounds with very different experiences. Where that ends for me is suggesting that as a collective group and a society group, because someone is coming from a place of perhaps some kind of trouble, some historical lack, just to put a word there to kind of illustrate the negative, that someone is at fault. I think there's a big difference between teaching empathy and then teaching there is empathy that requires someone else to kind of make allocations kind of against their rights. What I do want to kind of posit though, because you discussed that it's important that we kind of bring things up to our students to kind of go over things and we have these set of norms to guide things, but you also talked about that there should be certain things that as teachers we shouldn't bring up and shouldn't be discussing. So I'm kind of finding kind of some conflict there. And could you just help me like kind of clarify it? I'm probably lost in the weeds somewhere.
Yeah, I might have not articulated it well earlier. I think if you're referring to my earlier comment about certain things should be sort of universally or outright condemnable, that doesn't,
Sure.
I didn't take that, I did not mean by that there should be some things that we don't discuss at all. I think what I meant by that was that there are some things that in our discussions, teachers can and should condemn.
So depending on your spot on the political compass, that's going to look different. It's like, if we're just going to go ahead and pick right out of the bucket, like the trans issue in elementary education is really big at the moment. You might have one teacher that thinks that the transgender argument in elementary is tantamount to child abuse, where someone on the other side might suggest that it's incredibly important that trans children at that age are included and represented well. And by included, I mean that those certain actions and things that they're going through are rationalized and made normal. And I just want to clarify that as a teacher, me deciding what should or shouldn't be universally condemned on that intense of a political topic could get dangerous at some point. And do you kind of see kind of the danger of that, or am I off base? I'm sorry, Graham, I don't mean to take us off of what we're discussing. I'm just curious what Gary's mind is there.
Try to respond briefly because we're entering the speed round.
Yeah, I will just say that I hear what you're saying about it being tricky territory for an individual teacher to decide what is universally condemnable. And I don't think that my suggestion that there should be some things that are universally condemnable, I did not mean in that to say that each teacher should decide for themselves what those things are.
Gotcha, thanks.
So we just have a couple minutes left. So I'm going to ask kind of a final question and ask you both to weigh in, but in kind of a relatively brief manner. So if one believes that either social justice advocacy in the classroom is improper in any way, shape, or form, or one believes that involving students in social justice causes in some sense is okay, but there are guidelines, what do we need to do in the schools administratively? What can the schools do either to prevent it altogether, given the discretion teachers have in their own classrooms, or to control it so that it's something that's acceptable? Garry, I'll let you go first.
Yeah, so I think one of the things that we can do is we can move towards preparing teachers and developing teachers to facilitate these conversations in ways that don't become, so that they don't become huge conflagrations, right? And I think that that's one thing that school administrators can do in order to make schools places where social justice can be brought up, and in a way that does not always mean that there are these huge shouting matches that are happening between students. The other thing that I think we can do is we can begin to sort of weave in standards that help build certain competencies in our students that would bring about social justice, even if that doesn't necessarily mean we're directly engaging in social justice outright all the time. So for instance, I believe the new name is Learning for Justice, formerly Teaching Tolerance, has a list of standards that are around, inclusion, social justice, and the like. And I think that using that as an example might be one way, weaving in those standards, for example, might be one way to help bring about social justice without always talking about it, and making sure that we are still adhering to some of what others might consider those more foundational elements of education.
Tony, quickly, we're pretty much out of time, so please respond.
I would really encourage, since we're talking about advice to administrations, I would encourage administrators to kind of take a second look at how they're handling professional developments and classrooms within staff meetings. It's become a really common policy to suggest that there are voices that you want people to speak up, but then when those voices speak up, the answers that are given are very dismissive and one-off. I see this in a lot of things like racial equity trainings and things like this. And I really would encourage that if we're to bring open discussion about complicated issues such as, social justice to the classroom, we first have to make sure that our teachers are modeling the same thing, which means being able to foster an environment where the teachers in your school are allowed to openly disagree with things without, suggesting that they keep quiet, which is something that we do see in a lot of public schools. There have been a lot of emails and conversations between principals and teachers, dozens that I've spoken to in the last couple of months, who were told to keep quiet when they disagreed. And I think that for the sake of ideological diversity in general, especially regarding how we're going to model this ideological diversity to our students, it's important that we make sure our teachers know that regardless of their opinion, they're not just supposed to sit in staff meetings and be quiet.
Okay, thank you both. I think there'll be opportunities for Q&A from the audience once Ilana regains control. So Ilana, please take it from here.
All right, just give me a second here. So if we could have all of the panelists and moderators turn their videos back on, that would be great. Okay. All right, I think we're all here. All right, this was fascinating. So thank you, everyone. I mean, this is just really, I just am grateful for everyone being so generous with their time on a Saturday afternoon and for being here, and to our attendees and everything. So we have about 45 minutes or just under that for Q&A. And I'm going to I just want to make a couple of really quick comments. I've held my tongue since 1 o'clock. So I just want to make a couple of really quick observations, and then we're just going to go into some questions, and I'm sure we won't have time to get to all of them, but we will hopefully get to some of them. So one, just really quick, my first comment, this is going back now to the beginning, about homeschooling. It's interesting. And so I just want to make the comment, I homeschooled 2 of my kids for a number of years. And obviously there's a lot of different ways to homeschool, but there are I don't know if we have homeschoolers in the audience, like there are an enormous amount of resources out there. And in some ways for homeschooling, you have at your fingertips, you have more control than I'm not suggesting everyone should go homeschool, but if it's where you end up, you do have a lot of opportunity. There are a lot of resources available out there. That was just one thought. The question of how can we do better? So a lot of this came up in the last panel on these last 3 points. One is, I think we can do a lot better with respect to Garry and Tony. Like, I think we can do a lot better by being really explicit about our assumptions and explicit about and sort of explicitly acknowledging what it is that we're seeing around the world. And we can also be explicit about, look, is there consensus on this particular point? Like, is there agreement on this particular point or whatever? I think that can help. The question, and I'm almost done, the question of empathy. One, I just think it's such an interesting question about sort of teaching empathy. It always makes me every time someone brings up empathy and around the social emotional learning, I always think of Paul Bloom's book Against Empathy. And I always think about this question of, well, empathy is great. I mean, again, like I want my kids to be empathetic and I want people to be empathetic, but it never answers the question of who deserves your empathy and which groups do you empathize with. And how do you decide, especially when you can only pick one in terms of a particular outcome. And then the last point about which is condemnable. So Garry and Tony, this came up in about, what's condemnable, which is just this really interesting question. And sort of this idea, there are clearly some ideas and some positions where there is one idea or one way of looking at it that is obviously condemnable. I think it's almost like we need to first have the broader discussion of on what kinds of topics are there multiple perspectives that can exist on equal moral footing, and start there. And right, so I mean, not necessarily that we could come up with a list, but that would be a starting place. And then once you get to if you have some consensus, again, this is sort of idealistic, but about which topics there can be multiple perspectives on equal moral footing, then you would sidestep that condemnable problem, right? Because you're just saying, well, look, there's just different ways of understanding this. So I'm going to stop. All right, let's go to some questions. our first question is, what do we do about the ideological homogeneity in university education schools? The problem we're facing seems to be this homogeneity being implemented top down in the form of curriculum and pedagogy. So how do we answer this? The efforts of individual teachers seem insufficient in the face of this problem. So I can pick on people, but I'd rather just let people answer the questions they feel like they can speak to. Does anyone want to speak to the ed school question? Jonathan, go ahead. Oh, you're muted.
Sorry about that. My primary appointment is in an ed school, and it was at my previous job as well. And I take the point of the question, and I think that ed schools in some ways have been some of the worst actors when it comes to viewpoint diversity, if you look across, say, the past 10, 20 years. But I think there's also an important context to include here, which is that the other thing that's happened is that ed schools have lost their monopoly on teacher training. I mean, that's one reason why they've been suffering financially. And again, you can debate the merits of that, right? But between Teach for America and all the different teaching fellows programs and all kinds of other emergency certifications, it doesn't take away anything from the question, but I do think it's important to note that it's got a very different meaning in today's context than it might have in earlier generations.
Yeah, no, I take your point. I mean, I think that's a totally fair point.
Yeah, and I would add that I've taught in an ed school as a PhD student. My training is in a school of education. And I think often viewpoint diversity is not even modeled there, so there's this one way to teach social studies. There's this one way to teach English language arts. And so I think, and that's just like a cycle that perpetuates. They're in K through, go through the K through 12 system. There's a right answer to all of these things. Get into school of education. There's, maybe 2 or 3 right ways to do this, but usually, the faculty kind of take their stance on what the right way is. And so it's just this ongoing cycle of, a lack of exploration of how to teach certain subject areas. What have the conflicts been in those subject areas over time? Like reading, for example, is a big one. And so if you can't even engage in that viewpoint diversity, like the teachers don't get to do that themselves, then I think that's part of the problem.
And to pick up on Sam's point, I feel this very acutely when a student will ask me, for example, do you agree with this School of Ed's line on bilingual education or special education or whatever it might be? And I find that hilarious and appalling, if that makes sense. How could an institution have, quote, a line on a very complex, like social and cultural and pedagogical issue? It's also really boring, let's face it. There's nothing more interesting inherently than the way that human beings have organized themselves to transmit ideas and skills across generations. But some ed schools have managed to make that dull. And that's an achievement when you think about it. Take something that's inherently fascinating and make it dull. I don't say this happily, but it's real.
Anyone else want to weigh in? I would just add that, it's a hard question, right? How do you sort of change, how do you really sort of generate change in an education school, even though they may have a diminished role, per Jonathan's comment, than they did, some number of years ago? I don't know. Where I've landed on that personally is I just try and do what I can in my own classrooms and with my own students. Erin, did you want to add something?
Well, I'm just thinking, I think it's an interesting question. I'm not sure. I could be wrong. But I'm not sure that education schools really have that much power to really shape teachers' views. No offense to the school that I went to, but quite frankly, it makes sense to me why a lot of people don't do higher ed education training, right? So I have my master's in education, but I was an English major, and my English major really trained me very well to engage in viewpoint diversity, because that makes sense, right? But I think the thing that that we should maybe consider is educational leadership training, which is very popular. And that is where people go back to school. And then there's this whole context of, you know, when you go to educational leadership school to get your doctorate or whatever you're doing, then you're, I think, in a different position where you are imposing things, I guess, theoretically to get your school ahead or, you know, up to par with other competition. And I think that is actually a bit of a threat. And those do tend to be very liberal leaning programs, no question, that push a certain point of view. I don't know if that helps.
Yeah. Aura, and then we'll go on to our next question. You're muted. Aura, you're muted.
Yeah, I think another issue we should probably consider thinking about is a rough spot that young generation is in terms of pressure of fitting social image and navigating between where is the image and where is me. Again, I'm coming back to, and it should be addressed in a very nuanced way. So
Right.
I think it's for next conversation.
I think somebody had put in the chat earlier, you know, that more nuance should be a bumper sticker. So I think that was pretty funny. Okay, so let's go on to another question. As someone who works in diversity, equity, and inclusion and is a scholar, I'm curious about the perspectives of folks in this group. I often come across folks who claim diversity of thought affords them the right to discriminate against people who are different from them. And students often share stories of these experiences. Where is the line drawn? Discourse is powerful and should it, and we talked, there were a couple of this question of where is the line drawn has come up earlier. Discourse is powerful and should exist. I personally make an effort to speak to different people from myself who have varying viewpoints all the time. But if a person's opinion is that I or others should not have equal rights because of an identity that I hold, transgender, people of color, what is the line for students so they can feel safe and supported? And to be clear, I'm also including conservative, religious, et cetera, students in that space. So this is a little bit of a version, actually, Jonathan, that you brought up. It touches a little bit the question that you brought up at the end of your session.
I said earlier that I don't advocate for the equality of all viewpoints. I advocate for shining a light on many of them and having the possibility of debate on the table, right? That's what I wanted. That being said, if somebody has or wants to argue that I am, you know, subhuman in some way or something like that, that's not a conversation I'm going to have. You know, I'm not going to dignify that conversation with a response. So, you know, there is a fine line between, you know, a difficult conversation and a conversation that just shouldn't be had, you know? And I think we would do well to figure out what those conversations are. This is a long-winded way of saying I don't have an answer for this question. But what that question does prompt me to do is try to figure out where this line is. This is another version of the Overton window situation, right? You know, what's within the window and what's without and why. And I think this is something that we should evaluate and reevaluate consistently, right? We can't just settle on something. We should always come back to this question to figure out what's beyond the pale and what isn't.
Right. No, it's a great, Jonathan. I love people raising their hand. Jonathan, yes, you would like to speak? You're muted. You're muted.
Sorry. Yeah, just to reinforce, I was a student once too. It was just a really long time ago. Yeah. Look, we tried to make the kind of discrimination that Erec is alluding to in our book on controversial issues, which I co-wrote with a philosopher. And until I started doing that, I had no idea what philosophers do. Turns out what a philosopher does is spent 55 pages answering the question, what is a controversy? Like, I'm a historian, right? And a controversy is like, okay, people disagree, right? It's controversial. But of course, it's much more complicated than that. And I think Erec was alluding to those complexities. What is a legitimate controversy as opposed to an illegitimate one? and what's an appropriate controversy to entertain in schools as opposed to an inappropriate one.
Right.
And what we came up with, for whatever it's worth, is that an appropriate controversy is one where highly informed people disagree. So look, I understand that there are millions of my countrywomen and men that do not think don't think human beings share DNA with other creatures. I believe it's their right to believe that strongly and to speak that from the mountaintops in whatever way they'd like. But I do not think that's a legitimate focus of debate in classrooms, because the best informed people do not disagree on that proposition about whether human beings share DNA with other creatures. Likewise, I understand that there are millions of Americans who do not think that human behavior has contributed to warming the climate. Again, I think it's their right to believe that. I believe strongly in that, and it's their right to proclaim that in every way they can. But I will not have that debate in the science classroom or any other classroom. Now, the degree to which that behavior is warming the earth, what we should do about that fact, all fair game. But if you think that human behavior has had nothing to do with warming the climate, although you have a right to believe and say that, you have no right to see that, quote, debated in our classrooms. It is not a real controversy. It is a pseudo one.
Interesting. I have a point to make after Graham. Go ahead, Graham.
Yeah, so I think, Jonathan, your test, while it sounds nice, is extremely problematic, because a lot of the people right today who want to shut down debate believe that any opinion of that is contrary to theirs is not well informed. And so they could try to use your test and still shut down debate because they believe that anything that disagrees with them is ill-informed. And I do think that there are some very smart people who are very well informed. I mean, your global warming issue is a perfect example of one. I know that certainly there are a lot of people who believe the way that you believe, but I know that there are people who are very well informed who disagree. And if in fact the one position is so easily disproven, then John Stuart Mill would say all the more reason to put it out there, because then we need to disprove it. Because if we silence it, people will continue to believe it. So I'll just say that we ought to allow open debate on these issues, because otherwise they will be swept under the rug and will not be challenged.
Jonathan, do you want to respond before Tony?
Well, I would just say, I take the point. There are a lot of bad actors who pretend that a question is settled when it isn't. Okay. And I think Graham's absolutely right about that. Right. But I don't think Graham would want us to debate in classrooms whether different races are endowed with the same intellectual capacity, or even, whether they should have the same human rights. Because I'm an op-ed columnist, I meet lots of people that think that both racial minorities and Jews are in fact subhuman. Again, I feel it's their right to believe that, and even to email that to me, as distasteful as I find. But I'm not going to debate the question of whether different races are endowed with equal mental capacities. I do acknowledge that there are people who do not believe that, but I think that is a settled question. I don't think you're going to find credible psychologists, psychometricians, biologists who think otherwise.
But that's the point. You're doing harm to those people by not helping them learn, if you're not allowing debate over the issue.
Well, I guess, Graham, it depends what you mean by debate, right? I'm not in this to muzzle anybody, right? And if somebody in my own classroom were to claim that either African Americans or Jews don't have the same human capacities or ability to think or love as other people, I wouldn't kick that person out. I wouldn't penalize them in any way. But I also wouldn't say, that's a really interesting perspective. How about the people that share that perspective go on one side of the room, and the people who don't go on another? We give them some newsprint and magic markers, and all of them list the good arguments in favor of that. Because I think that would be duplicitous, right, and dishonest. Because the fact of the matter is there aren't good arguments for that position. I don't see any reason why I should pretend otherwise.
But isn't that the point, right? If there are no good arguments, it will quickly, that position will be quickly disproven. But I'll
Yeah, all right, yes, we could stay on this point for the next 26 minutes. Tony, do you want to add something?
Yeah, I think that this is really not to, make something sound easier than it really is, a more nuanced, difficult thing to approach. Whenever I had students that would posit things that I disagreed with, especially concerning all of the ins and outs of science education in my biology classroom, I would simply respond with data. I would respond with evidence. I would say, this piece of evidence disagrees with that. And if they say, well, I know this other piece of evidence, I have a choice. I can take that piece of evidence. I can look at that piece of evidence. I can say, I will look at that piece of evidence. I don't know how valid it is yet. Or I can simply introduce my students to the concept that there's a lot of data out there. And if I glue these numbers together in this way, I can make correlation look a lot like causation. And as a teacher, it's my responsibility that my students who are not, masters of ed degree, science educators in my room, that their unlearned questions or their questions that they are just approaching too out of rational thought. And I'm not going to use the race argument for this, because I think that's kind of a hyper normative example that I didn't really encounter either in rural or inner city environments. Like the pro-life issue or evolutionism versus creationism comes up a lot. And really, it's about sharing data and making sure the kids have the tools they need to make an informed decision. I think that's kind of maybe a compromise of a solution.
Right. But Tony, if after teaching that lesson, some of your students concluded that as a matter of science, the theory that the world was created in 6 days and then he rested is a better, stronger, more accurate theory than what Charles Darwin wrote, would you rest easily with that?
Oh, you're really going to love this. Considering I'm a creationist, I would absolutely rest very easily with that. Now, before your eyeballs pop out of your head in frustration, I'm suggesting that faith and science play in different ways together. And if a student who is, from another faith says that there's a different scientific explanation for something that's not race as being subhuman, for an extreme example, then I'm not going to challenge them, because as a personal faith decision, that's your call. I can only share the evidence that I have with you. And if you don't agree with it at the end of the day, you're not the one signing my teacher evaluation. I mean, I can only go so far. It's not my job to rescue every single mind.
Can I just say one thing? And this is not on the most recent point, but I think to this broader question, I think it's really important for us, going back to what you were saying at the beginning of this portion of the conversation, Eric, that we identify not only which conversations are on or off the table, but when we can engage in certain kinds of conversations and sort of the setting around certain conversations. It may or may not be a closed subject that, I don't think it's closed that like affirmative action policies should or shouldn't be implemented within institutions, for instance, right? But because I actually do see that as the discussion of that as maybe a minimalization of what certain groups of people have had to go through, I'm going to opt out of that conversation. And I think that because of that minimalization, I think it's important for whoever's leading that conversation to understand the ways that even acknowledging that as an open conversation continues to marginalize groups that might already be quite marginalized. And I think in our conversations, it's important for us to not intellectualize everything and to understand that some conversations, while intellectual sparring for some, are quite harmful to other people. And that may or may not mean that it's an open or closed conversation, but it might mean that the ways that we go about having that conversation need to be altered and amended.
That's a great point, Garry. So I want to from some of our panelists who have been quieter, Jessica, Sam, Erin, do you want to jump in, or Eric, or does anyone want to? I don't want, if you are silent by choice, I do not want to put you on the spot, but we would love to hear from you.
I just want to say thank you for that, Garry. I think that was a really good point, and I appreciate the perspective. I think this is a really interesting debate. I have seen in the chat a lot about social emotional learning as a gateway for CRT. And I know that that's something that people are talking about, but I'm going to say something that maybe a lot of people won't like, which is I think SEL is really important. I think it's actually important to the work of viewpoint diversity, because if you don't have self-awareness, which is really the work that social emotional learning does, you can't really extend that awareness to other people. And I hope that we would all agree that other people matter. And for that reason, social emotional learning is actually really like things like mindfulness, I think is what are skills. They're skills that we give to students and to ourselves, hopefully, to be able to pause and to respond rather than react. And these are things that are good things, you know, like I think that we get caught up in terminology sometimes. This is actually, I think, really important. This is why viewpoint diversity is seen by certain people to be a bad thing, because people are equating viewpoint diversity with negating all of these other really important initiatives that are actually making positive differences in schools. I mean, these are kids. And so there's not this, you know, I understand that it's a tense issue, but I just wanted to say that the people doing this work with children are critical, you know, for their education and their growth, their personal growth. So I just wanted to say that.
Thank you, Erin. I know, Tony, you wanted to say something, and then Eric, and then I wanted to make the comment. So Tony, go ahead.
So first of all, I think we're kind of dealing in response, Erin. I really like all of the values that you suggested and things that we should be teaching kids to do. I do not believe that's what social emotional learning has become in this country in a very broader context, especially considering organizations like CASEL in the last decade. So there's the idea of teaching students to pause and reflect. And then there are the ideas of teaching students that what they feel, no matter what, is valid. Those are two completely different things, but they've both come under the banner of a lot of organizations touting social emotional learning. So to clarify, I don't know if I can universally get on board with saying that social emotional learning is a great thing, and it can be a gateway to CRT. That's a valid criticism because it does set up the importance of an intersectional hierarchy, and especially through CASEL and a lot of the Indiana groups that I've talked to with a lot of the regards to SEL, that definitely comes through. That saying, I think it's important for us as educators to make sure that we're teaching students that, yes, they're valid people. Yes, they have individual rights. Yes, we should encourage them to be ideologically diverse, while recognizing that just because you having a thought is valid doesn't mean that you're always right and you're always in a good place, and that's fine. You know, when a kid runs up to my wife and, you know, punches her in the pregnant stomach, as happened last week, one of the diversity officers at her school very quietly swept it under the rug because the student was having a really, really bad day. And that really, really bad day manifested itself in a valid expression. And I'm not trying to contextualize your whole argument into one example. That's just where my mind goes, as just another guy to kind of respond to you.
Yeah, and my response wasn't actually, I mean, I appreciate that. And I think you're right. I actually think we agree on more than we disagree about this. But there is a but we don't have to throw the baby out with the bathwater. And so I think we need to be very, very careful with our language. If we're really interested in promoting viewpoint diversity as a viable thing that people will respond to, when we talk about ending initiatives in diversity, inclusion, and social emotional learning, many people are not going to see it as a legitimate way to go forward. Perhaps instead we could talk about the different ways we could use social emotional learning to meet the objectives that we think are important. So that's all. I just think it's a language thing, but I think it could be really harmful to the group.
Eric, did you want to add something?
Well, Tony said a lot of what I was going to say, but I guess I still have a little bit left here. In December, CASEL, the primary organization, I guess, for social emotional learning, came out and embraced this idea of transformative social emotional learning, which is the variation of social emotional learning that is problematic, that people are associated with CRT. That is not the way it's supposed to go. The way it's supposed to go is more in line with what Erin was talking about, is more in line with what used to be called emotional intelligence, self-awareness, self-management, social awareness, relationship management, and all the competencies therein. These are good things. SEL is supposed to give students the ability to handle being wrong. The ability to handle somebody else's different viewpoint. People who can't do that, people who bristle, are theoretically not emotionally intelligent. I teach a course called Communication Professional Cultures, which is about just that, using rhetoric in civic, professional cultures, whether it's a town hall meeting or a corporation. It is centered around emotional intelligence and empowerment theory. Because if you have those things, you are more likely to enter into a conversation with an open mind and heart and not protecting your viewpoint, right? This is what SEL is supposed to do. Unfortunately, it's been hijacked by CRT proponents, and we have what we have today.
So I want to ask a question. This is sort of going off, sort of building on, Garry, something that you said a few minutes ago, but just generally, I'm just curious, given sort of why we're here and the viewpoint diversity in K-12 education, but also it sort of touches higher education as well. I mean, a lot of my students, for example, like this semester, I have a class in social problems, and I think it's mostly first-year students. So I'm basically getting them a year after Erin's had them or Jessica's had, right? So like, there's really the difference. It's in some ways can be minimal depending on where they are in their education. But here's one way that I've thought about kind of viewpoint diversity and sort of approached this, just to be concrete about it, with students. And I'm just curious how this lands with the rest of the group, which is if you take an issue like, you take a specific sort of form of what some people might consider affirmative action, but something like how race is used in college admissions. And so one question that I've asked is I've said, with students is I've said, why might somebody oppose this policy, the use of race in college admissions? And invariably they'll say, well, because they're racist, because they resent the groups who stand to benefit from these policies. And, we'll just stop there. But like, let's say that's one answer. And then the response is, my response is usually, yeah, that makes sense, right? Like, so that absolutely makes sense in terms of why someone might oppose this policy. And then I say, well, is there any other reason why somebody might take that position, that they opposed it? And then they'll usually think about, well, okay, they'll come up with 3 reasons that are not other than racism. And then the question is, well, if all you know about the person is that they are opposed to using race in college admissions, and you've just listed that, here are 3 reasons why someone could take that position. One of them is racism, and one of them is this, and one of them is something else. Can you tell which reason is the one that's motivating them? And of course you can't. I mean, if that's all you know, obviously you can't. And so then the last question, and I'm done, is, well, what does it mean if we get it wrong? What does it mean if, like, given what we don't know, what does it mean if we get it wrong? And then, well, what does it mean if we get it wrong a lot? I don't know if we're getting it wrong a lot. I don't know what those numbers are, but what is that? What are the implications of that? And so that's sort of a concrete application, at least, again, there's no magic here, but like, of the application of thinking through viewpoint diversity and sort of bringing that in a way that is, I think, potentially less threatening and is not telling people, I mean, again, this sort of adage about, we don't tell people what to think, we tell them how to think, or we don't how to think, not what to think, whatever. But it really is, it's a little bit less aggressive. And so I don't know if other people have similar approaches, or, I mean, that's what I've done. And I enjoy, I mean, again, I'm sure there's a mixed feelings about sort of how effective that is, but I just wonder what other people think. Yeah, Jessica, go ahead.
Yes, so I take a very similar approach in my classroom, and that the class is really built on showing them a very specific process that they can then apply to whatever they're curious or whatever kind of issue they want to think through. And it's very much that. And because, like I said to you in an email conversation last week, my students have a very difficult time steel manning or star manning the opposite side. So we spend a lot of time like showing them the process to do that. So this way, when they kind of have these questions or they're kind of making the assumptions, they're through me in our class and the practice, they have a very specific thinking process. So a lot of it is spent on, well, how do you go about finding out or exploring that opposing viewpoint in a way that's authentic? So it's a matter of kind of training them to think about, okay, what sources do I go to? Like what stakeholders should I be listening to? Or like what voices do I need to hear? And I mean, we literally like map it out. And then it's a matter of creating a checklist and like, go find this and read it. And if you can hear it from a person who believes it, as opposed to like a journalist kind of giving voice to that, all the better. And so for me, it's like this very visual map that they're kind of going out and kind of finding and reading and synthesizing. And then it's a matter of like at the end, then I ask them, okay, well, has your thinking shifted? Or, you know, now what do you kind of see in the opposing side? And it's a lot of, again, looking at people making these arguments that they're coming from a place of good intent. So it's like acknowledging the validity of those views. Because like you were saying, like in the example that you gave, okay, the first thing that they might instinctually say is they're racist. And so, okay, well, in going through and listening or reading to their arguments, is there anything that you're hearing that does seem to have merit, or that you're like, okay, that you raise a good point, that gave me something to consider? So what we do in our classroom kind of mirrors what you're doing with your freshmen. And I find doing that over and over and over again is effective.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's also a point about just recognizing that, and I've said this multiple times, we just lost Erec, which is that I don't have all the answers. Like I have way more questions than I have answers. And so I'll just give you one more example and then we'll go to one more question. But, we spent a lot of time talking about identity, race and identity, and it's a very racially and ethnically diverse class. And, we'll talk, and if I ask the question, well, identity matters, but what does it mean if we make it everything? And what does it mean if we, is it possible to lean too much into identity while recognizing that it matters? And so, a student was talking, this was just a couple weeks ago, a student was talking about, basically like different, I don't know what you would call them, but different sort of racially or ethnically based affinity houses on campus. I don't know what there's probably a name for them, but just, whatever, this house or that house. And she was making the point, totally, I think reasonably, and she was saying, but the people who are drawn to those houses are probably people who are feeling the most marginalized, right? And who are most looking for that support. And I was like, yeah, that makes total sense. I was like, it doesn't answer the question though of can you lean into it too much, and who decides what's too much and what does that mean? And so again, it's just all of these questions. So I'm going to stop, but let's go to, we probably have time for one more question. So how about, let's see. This is a different kinds of question that we'll close on. There are laws that are trying to control pedagogy in Texas, Florida, Georgia, and other state houses. I think the biggest assault against free thought is Republicans playing to their base for political advantage. Does any other sect/group try to control others and their thoughts and exposure through laws? One of the biggest is the assault against critical race theory, which isn't being taught in K-12, but state houses have decided that it shouldn't be taught, even though it's not. So that should get people fired up.
Oh, dibs. Oh, did I get it quick enough?
What is that? Wherever the game Jeopardy, where you have
Jeopardy, I'll buzz in real quick. So first of all, according to Gloria Ladson-Billings and many of the other foundational scholars of critical race theory, it absolutely is being taught in K-12 education as a practice, not as the law theory in and of itself. That's an important distinction to make. As far as the left and the right passing legislation to mandate behavior, that's happening everywhere right now, whether we're talking about vaccines, whether we're talking about critical race theory legislation in state houses. Whenever you mandate a behavior, people don't like it. The polls show people don't like being told what they are to do in and out of their day by some distant person in a city that they're probably not normally in, and people that they don't normally know. Localized mandates see a little bit more success statistically, but still law mandated actions on behavior traditionally don't work. We're seeing this very interesting shift in the last 30 years where a lot of solutions that traditionally may have been handled by a local community or organization and then kind of imposed by local family and community groups are now being pushed and shunted off to state legislatures and national legislatures. There have been some that suggest that it's been kind of a lazy approach. It's an easy way for me not to have to deal with it. I'll just have my champion, and then you'll have your gladiator duke it out in the ring, and whichever one wins, you know, I'll say rah, rah, Republicans won, or rah, rah, Democrats won. I think this is an issue that we're seeing with a lot of fracturing of society, is that we've created this weird sports team dynamic for politics in which my side is going to force you to do what I want, and then other people saying that the other side is going to force you to do what I want. I will say that an encouraging thought, at least I'm seeing this on the right, and some people have seen this on the left, is a more hands-off approach to governance. There is a rise in kind of a libertarian-esque ideology in the last 30 to 50 years in this country that suggests, again, local communities and individuals have a better response to dealing with certain things, and it usually ends up being better for the community as a whole.
Does anyone want to have a final comment here?
Yes, I'll have a final comment. I'm literally looking at books that say that CRTs in high schools. I'm
You're
looking
looking
at
at
them right
what?
now. I'm looking at books
Oh, okay.
right now. It is in high schools. It's not subject matter. No fifth grader is reading Derek Bell, all right? They're not reading Richard Delgado. Their teachers have, and they are putting it into schools as praxis, right? They are shaping their teaching around the theory, well, around CRT. That's how it's in schools. I am so sick of people conflating praxis with subject matter. We know what you're doing. It's not going to work, okay? CRT is in schools. Tattoo that to the inside of your eyeballs. Eyelids, rather.
Okay. Well, thank you, Eric.
You're welcome.
All right. Jonathan, do you want to,
I would just add, look, I take these points and I think there's a lot of, let's just say, definitional debate, you know, about what constitutes CRT or even a CRT-like perspective. And I do think that, you know, if you think of an initiative like the 1619 Project, depending on how one is defining CRT, I think it'd be fair to say it was inflected by some of the same philosophies that you could associate with CRT. But to me, the real question is, who's going to be the decision maker here? And to Tony's point, I don't want it to be the state legislature. And, you know, I think it's so ironic. I mean, I'm the sort of Democrat that watches a lot of Fox News because I want to understand how people that think differently from me think. And on Fox News, what you hear is cancel culture decried over and over again. And depending on how you're defining that and which campus you're talking about, Fox News sometimes has a good point on that. But surely these laws represent the most naked form of cancel culture. I think you can critique CRT and you can critique 1619 Project in a whole variety of legitimate ways. But the whole idea of a state legislature saying that we're going to actually take them off the table, it seems to me that anybody who cares about the value of free exchange and independent thought in this country has to despise that.
So just to close this out, and we'll make just some concluding remarks, but I just to recognize explicitly that you can have concerns about, and many people do, about what's happening. I mean, sort of motivates this conference, broadly speaking, about what's happening in K through 12 education with respect to the way race, identity, fairness, whatever, all of these things are talked about, and still not support legislative changes as the solution, right? Like, so there's not, both of those things can be true. So I just want to, at this point, we probably need to conclude, but I want to thank everyone for joining the conference, and thank you to our distinguished panelists and moderators for their insights. We'd also like to extend our thanks to Heterodox Academy and the Educational Liberty Alliance for sponsoring the conference. We encourage you all to join the Heterodox Academy K through 12 education community and the Educational Liberty Alliance so you can connect with other parents, teachers, and administrators and citizens who care about viewpoint diversity in K through 12 education. We also strongly encourage you to reach out to us at the newly launched the Mill Center for the Advancement of Critical Thinking. After the conference, we'll be in touch via email with a special project that you can get involved with to help advocate for viewpoint diversity in your local schools. So please stay tuned for that. In the meantime, if you have any questions, you can email the conference administrator at admin@k12diversethought.org. Thank you so much, everyone, for being so generous with your time on a Saturday afternoon. And thank you for being here. Have a great day.